So let me close this door. All right, thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and once again, we have another debate. Last time we took a break from debates. We had an interview with Mr. Gary DeMar. And we talked about God and government, but this time we're jumping right back into debates, and then we're going to have like 4, 5, 6 more debates after this one. So we have a lot going on with The Gospel Truth. As you know, The Gospel Truth is here to engage the culture with Christian truth. And with that, we like to do debates, we like to interview, and we like to do lessons. So that's how we are engaging the culture with Christian truth. But with that said, I do want to go over a couple of announcements before I introduce those who are the participants of this debate. September 25th, I'll be having Andrew Rappaport versus Steve Bono, and he calls himself Destiny, and they'll be debating, is secular humanism superior to Christianity? That is coming up September 25th. October 1st, 2019, I'll have Ricky Croning on versus Miles Patrick. And Miles Patrick is a Black Hebrew Israelite, so they're going to be debating, is obedience to the law required for salvation? They got three subject matters here. Is obedience to the law required for salvation, interpretation of Deuteronomy 28, and is Jesus God? So that's going to be a long-winded one, so look out for a good 2.5-hour debate there. October 5th, 2019, we have Scarlett Clay versus Gina Belk. And if you know Gina Belk, she is from the Atheist Experience, and she co-hosts at times with Matt Dillahunty. So she's decided to come on with Scarlett Clay, and they're going to have a discussion concerning epistemological justification for the belief in God. So that should be a good discussion. And might also add that Scarlett Clay and Gina Belk are my first female participants. So that's exciting times. It's always good to be able to get the females involved. They're able to defend the faith and argue their points as well. So it's always wonderful to bring them on. October 6th, Miles Kettleson and Taylor Gray. He calls us The Snake is Right. I believe that's his YouTube channel, The Snake is Right. And they'll come on, they're going to be debating, can atheism account for objective morality? So that's just the next 4 shows. I have a whole bunch of shows coming up. I'm all the way booked all the way to mid-December. So there's going to be a lot of shows coming up, and there should be exciting times over here. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce these guys. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but I just want to give you a rundown of how I met Eli and met Chris. I met Chris. I hit him up on YouTube, I believe it was, and, I offered him, I wanted him to come on and debate a Christian opponent, and he was more than welcome to do so. His conversation is cool. He hit me up we connected on Facebook and everything, and then I was able to connect him and Eli together, and they was able to have a quick conversation to set up the debate, so I appreciate Chris for coming on. And then Eli's cool cat, man. He's alright, dude, man. But Eli's real cool, man. I see a friendship with me and him really growing, and I appreciate all he's doing for the body of Christ, and his little 5-minute videos that he puts out, very, very helpful in growth in the body and love for Christ and theology as well for learning who God is. So I really appreciate Eli and Chris for coming on, but that's enough of me. I'm rambling a little too much. I'm going to go ahead and let these guys introduce themselves and what they got going on, and then we'll get into the debate format. So first up, Eli, go ahead and introduce yourself for me.
Well, my name's Elias Ayala. That's my full name. My friends call me Eli. I am a middle school and high school teacher. I teach at a Christian private school, and on the side, I do apologetics. I have an apologetics ministry called Revealed Apologetics, and really my goal is to just help Christians understand why they believe what they believe and how to defend it, and I try to do that the best I can. I really, really enjoy discussions. And this is actually my first kind of formal debate with a formal format. So I'm kind of excited about that. And I'm married. I've got 3 kids, and I'm 37 years old, if that matters.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate you. All right, Chris, if you can, do a quick introduction to yourself.
Sure thing. My name is Chris. Most people probably know me as Cyrus the Skeptic. I have a YouTube channel, about 24,000 subscribers over there. That's what I do full time. On there, I do a combination of politics, social issues, counter-apologetics, sometimes just bringing people on and not engaging in counter-apologetics. I've hammered out where we come on for more standard discussion. Recently, if any of you are familiar with James from Modern Day Debate, he has a particular version of Pascal's wager that he likes to use. We had him come on to discuss, which was really interesting. A lot of people enjoyed that episode. So yeah, pretty much what I'm all for is discussions and helping people figure out why they believe what they believe. I don't have any particular goal as far as like converting or deconverting anybody. As long as the reasons that they have for believing what they believe are justified, then I'm fine with that, as long as they're not causing any harm.
Okay, I appreciate both of you introducing yourselves. So the format for this debate is going to be, we're going to go into opening statements, and we're going to have about a 60-minute discussion. No 60-minute discussion is going to be you guys are going to get 3 opportunities each to go ahead and ask questions for 10 minutes. I'll be the moderator of that time. So whenever that time is expired, I will conclude it wherever you're at in your statement. I'm going to conclude the time, then the next person will get that 10 minutes. So with that said, I believe, Eli, you're arguing the affirmative. So with the affirmative has to go first in formal debates. So Eli, you are up first with your opening statement.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank Marlon. Thank you for having me on your show, and I really enjoy and appreciate what you're doing. I think this is great to have the context for people to discuss competing ideas and things like that within respectful context. I think that's very important. And I'd also like to thank Chris for being willing to be here to interact with me a bit. I look forward to an engaging conversation, and I have to admit, I don't know much about Chris, so I'm looking forward to listening to what he has to say. And so there we go. So thank you for being here as well. So with that said, let me go right into my opening statement. First, I'd like to define the terms of this debate as I see it. Does God exist? And for me as a Christian theist, I deny the existence of any other God other than the Christian one. And so I'm going to be defending specifically Christian theism today, for I do not believe that any non-Christian conception of God is rationally coherent and not without detrimental philosophical problems once the details of these competing deities and or worldviews are fleshed out. And I do not find the non-Christian worldview systems to be rationally defensible, as I find them unable to provide the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience. And by way of kind of a quick summation, I do not find non-Christian worldview systems to be defensible in that they either have internal inconsistency problems, or if we grant their hypothetical truth, such systems can be shown to undermine human reason and experience. Now, to the nature of the debate, as I understand it, we need to be very careful, since when we're engaging in debates over the question of God's existence, there is all too often the naive assumption that we can proceed in a tit-for-tat back-and-forth discussion over individual pieces of data, facts, or evidence. When in reality, this debate is not an issue of facts absent of a worldview context. The debate between the Christian and the skeptic, or the Christian in any other form of the non-Christian position, is really a debate over worldview systems. And so if my opponent desires to discuss any particular point, I will politely remind him that any particular point of contention will only and can only have meaning and coherency within a broader worldview context. I do not believe that we can discuss any particular fact in some sort of neutral worldview independent fashion. And since my worldview foundation is in diametric opposition to any non-Christian foundation, I'm going to take issue with the interpretation of any particular point of contention taken on its own. For since we both will be operating from different worldview perspectives, different paradigms, if you will, it becomes foundational to this debate as to which position has a worldview context out of which the intelligibility and coherency of any fact is possible. So in quick summary, this debate is not over evidence per se, although I believe that my position has both evidence and a worldview context in which something like evidence even makes sense. But rather, our debate is one over competing worldviews. We're debating competing systems of thought, and I having a Christian worldview and Chris having a non-Christian worldview. Now, there may be a temptation from the skeptical perspective to suggest that since they're taking the negative position, that there is therefore no requirement to put forth a defense, but rather the task is merely to evaluate the validity of the Christian's position. I'd like to point out that while I am happy to admit that I am taking the positive position, I'm making the positive assertion that the Christian God exists, I would also point out that every non-Christian perspective has explicit or implicit positive assertions of the falsehood of the Christian worldview. For instance, if the skeptic's position is to suggest that they do not know if the Christian God exists, this itself is implying the Christian worldview is false, since an important assertion of the Christian worldview is that in a very profound sense, all men know that God exists. Now, the skeptic is free to reject this idea of all men knowing God in some sense, which I would imagine Chris would want to reject. I don't think he believes that. But by rejecting this Christian proposition, he is saying, in essence, that the Christian worldview is false. And if this is his position, then we will need to engage in some intellectual sparring over worldviews. Or again, if the skeptic wants to take the tact of discussing particular facts that are neutral, or he wants to take the tact that it is even possible or even appropriate to come to these issues in a neutral fashion, he again would be implying the falsehood of the Christian worldview, which teaches that there is in fact no neutrality. For on the Christian worldview, every fact has its meaning in the ultimate definer of fact, which is God himself. So every fact is what it is because God has created these facts to be what they are. And hence, if someone defines a fact that is contrary to how God has sovereignly defined that fact, then I would argue that the person redefining that fact contrary to God's definition is wrong and does not understand that fact truly. So in essence, my point here is that no fact is neutral. The nature of this debate is not over piecemeal issues, but rather over worldview systems, which themselves give particular facts their meaning. But the question then becomes, whose worldview can provide the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience? For this, I now turn to the nature of my particular argumentation. So as I have elucidated thus far, the nature of this debate is that of worldview against worldview, principle against principle, system against system. Having competing systems or worldview perspectives, are we relegated to a standstill, unable to push the debate any further, since whatever fact the skeptic brings, I'm going to interpret in light of my worldview, and every fact that I bring, he's going to interpret in light of his? Well, I don't think that this is the situation, that we're just at an immovable standstill. I think we can break this apparent standstill by demonstrating the truth of one's perspective transcendentally. So the nature of my argument for God's existence is transcendental in nature. For those who may be listening, what do I mean when I speak of transcendental arguments? Well, when we speak of transcendental arguments, we are in essence asking, what are the preconditions? That is to say, what must be the case in order for something else to be the case? An easier way to understand this would be something to the effect like, I'm standing on the floor in my house, I'm standing in my living room, for instance. What are the preconditions for my being able to stand up in my living room? Well, among other things, the beams upon which my house is built need to be under the floor holding everything up. If the beams aren't there, then I wouldn't be standing, but here I am standing up. So the beams need to be there. So that's just a simple example to kind of get the idea. Transcendental argumentation asks what must be the case in order for something else to be the case. If we use the examples of the laws of logic, you need to understand that transcendentals are proven by the impossibility of the contrary. So suppose someone rejected the laws of logic. The transcendental necessity of the laws of logic are clearly seen in that even in denying them, one needs to presuppose them in order to deny them. In other words, the transcendental necessity of the laws of logic are demonstrated by the impossibility of the contrary. Deny them, and you demonstrate their existence in your very denial, since your denial necessarily presupposes them. In like fashion, my argument is this, that the proof of the existence of the God of Christianity is that if he didn't exist, one could not prove anything at all. If one denies the Christian theistic worldview, I would argue that such a denial would reduce the non-Christian's perspective to absurdity. Now again, the temptation will be to suggest that my argument is merely an assertion, but to think such fails to recognize the nature of my argument and the nature of transcendental arguments in general. Remember, the transcendental argument for God's existence is an argument. And it is my job in this debate to make good on my argument, and I'm going to try my best to do so. So what is required of my opponent today? If my argument is that the proof for the truth of the Christian worldview is that if it were not true, one could not prove anything at all, what my opponent must do is to lay out his own worldview and demonstrate that given the truth of his own worldview outlook, he can save knowledge, science, logic, meaningful history, rationality, induction, and in essence, intelligibility. Hence, given the very nature of my argumentation, Chris is not relegated to merely stating his lack of belief if that's his position. Again, I will let him speak for himself, and only responding to why he thinks my view is insufficient. The very nature of my argument requires the responder to show his hand and lay out his own perspective, his worldview, and engage system versus system. In essence, what ground is Chris standing on? What is his worldview foundation? And is that foundation coherent and consistent? And does it provide the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience? What is his worldview? What does he believe about the nature of reality? What does he believe about how knowledge is gained? What does he believe about how we should live our lives? And is what he believes about these things consistent with each other? What becomes especially interesting is, what is his epistemology? How will he address these issues? He could go the rationalist route. Everything that's true must be coherent. But how does he avoid the traditional problems with rationalism? He can go the empirical route. Knowledge comes through sense perception and experience, but how does he answer the issues that are inherent within empiricism? Or he can combine the two and go the way of Kant, but then that perspective, I would argue, has its own problems. Again, I don't want to speak for Chris, so we're going to wait and see what he has to say, and from there engage in worldview interaction. But for now, I think this is sufficient to lay out the issues at hand. And so for now, I concede my time.
All right, thank you, Eli, for your opening statement. I appreciate you for that. Chris, it is now your turn for a 2-minute opening.
Sure thing. Okay. So, as far as my personal epistemology...
Hey, Chris, I can't hear you.
Can you not hear me?
You might be muted.
I shouldn't be muted. You should be able to hear me just fine.
I think your audio went out, Chris.
Hold on.
Let me see. Why did it go out? Yeah, I lost your audio.
Is it working now? Sure thing. Okay, can you hear me now?
All right, Chris, you there?
Yep, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Excellent.
Lost the audio like that. That's crazy.
That was
But
weird.
anyway, go ahead, Chris. You got it.
Sure thing. So my positions, I'm going to go ahead and lay them out now because they're going to come up in conversation later anyway. My personal epistemology is that of pragmatism, which in a very brief sense argues that what is useful is ultimately what we end up working with. As a result, if we're looking at science, pragmatism would argue that for the purposes of science, we would use instrumentalism, which is the view that concepts and theories are useful instruments, and progress of science cannot be couched in terms of concepts and theories somehow mirroring reality. They have to work on an instrumental basis and are used for the purposes for the amount of time that they are required there. When it comes to things like metaphysics, some pragmatists like John Dewey were empirical thinkers. So it really depends on what you get there. Where pragmatism has issues is that it is sometimes, what's the best word for it? Sometimes it works against itself. But also pragmatism was literally built on three people not agreeing with each other about what pragmatism is, so I would argue that sometimes those inconsistencies are inherent to the inner bakings of pragmatism, and I don't see a problem with that. As long as it gets the job done and it's useful, that's what it's there for. That said, moving on to my position on God. So if we're talking philosophically speaking, then I have to label myself an agnostic. I don't have a choice. If we're talking colloquially, then I'm perfectly fine labeling myself an atheist under, say, the lack of belief position, anything like that. But again, it depends on which side of the coin we are arguing for, hard philosophical definitions, or if we are arguing for more colloquial, or as I would say, useful definitions. Whichever one you want to use, perfectly fine with me. I go on an atheist on my channel since that's common parlance. That's fine with me. My position on God, being that it's basically agnostic, is that I suspend belief on the proposition of God. This goes for all gods. However, that does not mean that I deny any particular God unless I find that that God has logical problems. I'm perfectly fine accepting the laws of logic, because it is through laws like that, like the law of non-contradiction, that I start to have issue with the way God is presented, at least in the standard Christian worldview. Insofar as the term standard Christian worldview even has a coherent meaning. Just as there is no atheist worldview, there is no agnostic worldview, I would argue that there are at least 40,000 Christian worldviews, and probably more, depending on how many individuals there are with worldviews based on Christianity. If there were one coherent Christian worldview, then we wouldn't have a series of no true Scotsman fallacies battling each other over the last 2,000 years. As far as God, The God of the Bible is denoted as a God of love. Before we can get into this conversation about what a God of love means, we have to figure out what type of love we're talking about, because the biblical version of God is going to argue that his version of love would be what we would call agape love, which would be unconditional love. For anybody who's unfamiliar with the term agape, I would say that that is the type of love that is most coherent and most often given to God. My problems with that, though, are that unconditional love would denote certain things. For one, it would denote that people that he loves, he may not commit genocide against. I know that it's the common played out trope to go to the flood, but unfortunately it is in the Bible, so I'm going to have to go to it. It's hard for me to square the circle of a all-loving being that would actually commit genocide against all of his creatures, especially if this being is all-knowing and all-powerful, which means that they not only had other options available to them, being all-powerful, they also knew what these options were because they are all-knowing. And because they are omnibenevolent, they would be behooven to act on these other less cruel notions, and yet they didn't. So obviously one of these traits isn't there. Either they are not all-powerful and they had to choose one of the more violent routes, or they are not all-knowing and could not conceive of one of these less violent routes, or they are not all-loving, in which case the violent route may have even seemed to be a beneficial one at that case, denoting some type of catharsis. Alternatively, there is also the problem of hell. However, my particular issues of hell will always be contingent on the type of hell that the Christian is asserting. As I do not know what Eli's version of hell is, I do not know if this is an annihilation concept, or if this is more of a, hey, you're going to be burning forever, like the standard Baptist teaching. I know that he's a Calvinist, but I do not know, I have not heard yet his particular variant of hell. So I cannot bring the hell argument in unless I know what his version of hell is. So I will go ahead and have to skip over that for the time being. Back to the type of love God has. God's love is best described as unconditional love, or agape. He is the embodiment of love and somehow created things like the global flood and hell. But again, I'm not going to bring up hell in detail because I do not want to speak for Eli's view on hell without knowing what it is. However, this does lead us to some problems, at least as far as I'm concerned. If God created everything, which if we're to accept the Christian worldview and work within it, we would have to accept that he did create everything. There is no start without him being a first cause. We have to accept that he also created evil. This is supported by the book of Isaiah. But if God is all-knowing, he would know that the result of any of his actions would lead to evil, either its creation or lead to him having to enact some type of evil. If he knew ahead of time that any of his actions would lead to evil, which if we grant that he's omniscient, we have to, then any action that he takes that would lead to evil can be considered evil. I don't think consequentialism works as a moral framework for most people, because most people do not know what the end result of any of their actions will be. This is one of the reasons why in a court of law, for instance, intent is only one part of an equation. That's how we determine motive sometimes. But a lot of times we will argue things based on what the consequences of actions were, as well as with the intent. With God, the intent is not part of the equation, only the consequences. And the reason for that is because God, regardless of intent, knows what the consequences are. He is in a privileged position to know the consequences of any and all actions, moral or otherwise. So while most actions, any action from a human can be considered moral, immoral, or amoral, depending on your particular ethical framework, Yahweh's actions necessarily create evil, because consequentialism is the only way that we could really judge him, because he knows the consequences of his actions. Again, a privileged position unlike anyone else. For God to create anything, that thing must be within his nature. Well, we know that God can create evil. He's created things that necessarily led to evil, and he knew that, and he had the power, and I would assume with omniscience the creativity, to do otherwise, and actively chose not to. This means that creating evil is within God's nature. If creating evil is within God's nature, it must also then follow that evil is within God's nature. If evil is within God's nature, the idea that he's omnibenevolent must necessarily be discarded. This is a particular omni trait that can no longer hold. The only way that I could find to escape this is to somehow judge God by a standard of morality that one does not know, either by arguing a la the Euthyphro dilemma that all goodness stems from him, in which case, how can we even consider God good? Even something like divine command theory considers itself ethical subjectivism. Or we can argue that God is separate from good, and that he adheres to good, in which case he's bound by it. Now, I recognize that this is probably not Eli's position. Eli's position is more than likely going to be that good necessarily stems from God, necessitating that God would be above any of these laws. I would argue then that if this means that we can never judge the moral character of this being whatsoever, then how can we call him good? We can't call him evil, so we must necessarily not be able to call him good, as these two are polar opposites, and our ability to judge one will be contingent on our ability to judge the other. So if we are going to argue that God is above all moral, what's the word for it? If we're going to argue that God is above all moral judgment, and say that good necessarily stems from him and therefore he's above these judgments, then again, I will point out that this means that we cannot call him good. The omnibenevolent trait still has to be dropped off, because there is no way for us to judge that particular trait. It's impossible at that point. Finally, if we imagine the life of a single person as an inch on a ruler, think of how many inches you have. Everybody's lifespan is an inch. Well, you have not an infinite, but a perceivably infinite amount of lifetimes there in which a series of evil actions can take place. However, God is eternal. And we would also think, even regardless of what the particulars on a version of hell are, we would at least think that God knows that any punishment that he gives, should it be eternal, compared to this inch, if you extend that life force of a person from the inch to, say, the square footage of your house, that's still nothing in comparison to eternity. Change the square footage of the house to the circumference of the earth. This person is now living for thousands and thousands of years relative to the inch that we gave originally. This is still not eternity, though. Any punishment that God decides to enact on these people, and it would be him deciding to enact, again, he's bound by consequentialism at this point, would be considered evil. One of these traits has to go. One of the omni traits has to leave. If the God is going to be described as a tri-omni God, then one of these traits is going to have to be yeeted out the window. I'm perfectly fine with taking the omnipotent out. I'm perfectly fine taking the omnibenevolent out. That's just me. If God is going to be described as a perfect tri-omni God, there's the incoherence for me, and that's my time.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Eli, for those opening statements. All right, now we're transitioning to the core of the debate, the crossfire, the most exciting part of a debate. So once again, the affirmative goes first. So we're going to allow Eli to question Chris for his first 10-minute cross-examination.
All right. You said a lot of good things, and what I first want to get out of the way is I appreciate it, because most atheists or skeptics or whatever don't usually come out and share their views as clearly as you did. So I appreciate that. So you said that God creates evil. What is your view? What do you think Christians believe about the ontological nature of evil?
The ontological nature of evil? That which would be the opposite of good.
Okay. Do you think, on the Christian view, evil has an ontological essence?
In the Christian worldview, I'd say that good and evil both have ontological essence. My personal thought, though, this is just me speaking from my worldview. Obviously, we're going to have to be doing a lot of that. My personal thought is that good and evil are labels that we assign onto actions. And what we assign onto those actions a lot of times can be a matter of perspective. So if I see, for instance, if I see something like, say, a family member of mine is killed, I see that as evil. However, from somebody else's perspective, that might not be seen as evil. But that's never going to change the fact that, to me, this is going to be considered an evil action.
Right. And so, I'm trying to ask these questions because I'm trying to understand how you perceive what Christians believe about the ontological essence of evil. In other words, to say that God creates evil, we do not believe that he actually creates this thing called evil. And evil is a privation. And so there's not something that God creates and it's called evil. Evil is something that is not in conformity with his nature. So, and violates his law or whatever. So it's more of action that is in disconformity to the standard, which is God. So it's not something that he actually creates out of his nature. So I would say that your statement in regards to God creates anything that's consistent with his nature, God creates evil, therefore God is evil, or something to that effect, I would say that it doesn't follow, since the Christian position, we do not hold that there's this positive ontological essence of evil that God creates. That's why I was asking the question. So you gave me a view of what you think evil is, but that's not what the Christian position holds to. So do you want to clarify a little bit of what you think the Christian position is, and maybe perhaps retract that as an argument, or you can clarify and rephrase the argument?
Sure. So if I could, I know this is your time to question me, but there is one of these things that I would have to
Sure.
say necessarily leads into it. Do you believe that God creates color?
I'm sorry?
Do you believe that God creates color?
That's it? Well, again, I don't want to overstep the bounds. You could ask me when it's your turn. So I don't want to, because once we let the question go back and forth, then we'll kind of intermix and we'll defeat the whole purpose of cross-examination.
Fair
So you
enough.
could ask me that question, and I'll try my best to answer that.
Then
All right,
I
so,
will have to say
again,
that
so I
I'll have
don't-
to
so I
side.
don't-
At that point, I'd have to actually
Say it.
sidestep your question because my answer will necessitate your answer on that. So we'd have to move on to another question at that point.
Okay. All right. So in regards to epistemology, you said you are a pragmatist, right?
Yes.
Do you believe in objective truth?
I believe that the concept of objective truth can be useful. But as far
Do you
as
believe that there is something? Do you believe that there is objective truth?
I have a definition of truth, if that will work for you.
Do you understand what I mean when I say objective truth?
Perhaps you could clarify.
Okay. I think objective truth deals with something that is true, independent of our personal opinions.
Mm-hmm.
So something is true, independent of what we think about. And there's something out there that's objectively truth. Do you believe that there is objective truth? And do you believe that it's possible for someone to know that objective truth?
So, for somebody to know an objective truth, that actually would fit into my personal definition of truth. My definition of truth in general is, if something. Well, hold on. Best to say, my definition of truth is that which comports to reality. My definition of knowledge is a belief that comports with reality. If you believe, so if we have a Venn diagram, truth is on one side, belief is on another. Where truth and belief collide is where knowledge is, at least in my personal worldview. If you believe something and it happens to be true, then you have knowledge.
Is there any way that someone could have access to what is actually the case so that they believe things that are true and that they can know them to be objectively true within your worldview perspective?
Within my worldview perspective, strangely enough, so within pragmatism, something being objectively true, as in something having ontological value, correct? Is that how you would define this?
I would say that something to be objectively true, we are believing something. We have, again, I would define truth as a justified, or knowledge as a justified true belief. Can we have beliefs that are true, and we have justification for believing they're true, and those reflect the objective reality?
So, justified true belief, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, but justified true belief basically takes the Venn diagram that I have, where believed things and true things are on one side, knowledge is in the middle, and it adds a third piece to the Venn diagram, where there's a justified side. So anything that is justified and believed and true becomes knowledge.
So can we have access to objective reality such that we know it, on your perspective of pragmatism, an epistemological view of pragmatism?
I would agree that we don't actually have access to objective reality. Everything that we see, everything that we perceive is filtered.
Okay, so if that's the case, then would you say that your worldview system lacks the preconditions for intelligibility, since every worldview would have to have some forms of truth or something to undergird a foundation for knowledge?
So intelligibility just has to do with whether or not it is intelligible. I know that's a bit of a tautology. Basically, if something can be, it's basically if something can be understood or is accessible or digestible. Under pragmatism, yes, because literally, if something is unintelligible or undigestible, then it's going to be discarded. That's what happens in pragmatism. If something cannot be understood in its form, then it must be set up in a way and so that it can be understood while also still being true. So, for instance, if I were explaining a mathematical concept to somebody and my method was unintelligible, then my method would need to be discarded and I would need to find a new method in order to teach the person.
Okay, but when I say intelligibility, what is the preconditions for intelligibility? Well, logic has to be binding. We need to have correct reasoning processes within an epistemological perspective that is pragmatic, and that you don't, as you've admitted, you don't have access to objective truth. Mm-hmm. How can we hold those consistently within your worldview? That we need logic, these unchanging universal standards, unless you want to define how you understand logic. How do you have those things which we must know objectively, but within a worldview in which we have no access to objective reality. It seems as though, on the one hand, you would say we have no access to it, but then to even have intelligibility, you have to presuppose it, since you have to presuppose the validity of logical laws in their
you've just made two.
nature.
So you've just made two separate statements, and I want to point this out to you because I don't think you're a bad faith actor. So I'm 90% certain you didn't catch that you said this, but you said one has to presuppose that we can ascertain essentially the ontological truth of something, if we can ascertain if something is ontologically true. And then you said, but on the other hand, you argue whether or not something is in fact ontologically true. Here we have a warring of issues. On the one hand, you're asking about personal perception, and on the other hand, you're asking about ontology. Personal perception is going to be a perception of ontology and a filtering of what is objectively true. As an example, I asked the question earlier, but I will say it in a statement form instead because it is required for this. If you're familiar with the concept of is your green my green, this is a very common concept for things like color theory. Is your green my green basically says, if I'm looking at an item and I perceive that it is a shade of green, is that item in fact green? Is the ontological nature of this item's color green? Well, there's a lot of things that go into that. For one, my perception of it is that this object is green. If we just look at the perception of the shade, someone else's perception of that is going to be that it is a completely different shade of green. We can get 10 people to disagree on what shade of green a particular leaf is. However, if we actually look at what goes into making a green leaf green, we find that the only color that is absent in that leaf is green, because the leaf itself is absorbing every color except the green. It's reflecting the green, and that's why we see that. So is this leaf actually green? Well, again, we come to, well, no, ontologically it's not green. So does it have color? Well, yes, it contains all colors. Well, no, it's actually containing wavelengths. This is the problem with ontology versus perception. My perception of this is being filtered through several different chasms in order to get to the point where I perceive this leaf as green, but ontologically that statement doesn't even make sense.
All right,
so let me interject there. So are you saying that we cannot know objective reality, we only know perception?
I would say we can only know perception.
That's time, fellas. That's time.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, Chris, it is your turn to cross-examine Eli for 10 minutes.
Sure thing. And I'm sorry if I ate up the last couple minutes there, Eli.
That's okay.
It was not my intent. That's why I was trying to ask that as a question beforehand. I'm also eating into my time now here, unfortunately. Okay, so one of the things that you pointed out is that we're having a conversation on worldviews, therefore we can't have a tit-for-tat discussion. But if we can't have a tit-for-tat discussion, then what is the point of us even having a conversation at this point? I'm not trying to be rude there, but...
No, it's not just a tit-for-tat discussion. What I said was a tit-for-tat discussion over specific things. In other words, what I'm focusing on is that the difference between you and I is not an issue of just merely I have a fact that you don't, or we're arguing for specific things. I just wanted to bring the point that when we're discussing these issues, it's system versus system, not independent, neutral facts. That's what I meant by that.
Okay, that's fair. And then another point you brought up stemming from that, the debate isn't about facts, it's about worldview systems. If your opponent desires to discuss a particular point, that point can only work in reference to a worldview. So, for instance, if I were to ask you the nature of truth, you would embed that in God, correct?
I would say that God is the source of all truth because creation reflects, what his plan, his purpose, everything that is made is understood within that context. So things are true because God makes them true.
Okay. So my question then becomes, one of the criticisms that you gave for and it's one of the things that you noted that I didn't do, so I do thank you for noting that, is that there's a slippery nature where a lot of skeptics are concerned, where they take the lack of belief position and then just say, I'm not convinced, I'm not convinced, I'm not convinced, and they won't actually give you, this is my worldview, this is how I came to it, these are my positive assertions against a particular type of God. They just hide behind, I'm not convinced. Do you see there as being any functional difference between that slippery nature and the nature of being able to hide behind, well, nothing's true without God, so therefore everything doesn't work without God?
I think it's irrelevant. I'm not, the nature of my argumentation is not that I'm hiding behind God. I actually think that the worldview of the Christian worldview actually is the preconditions. I'm not just saying God, just answers the question, but it just so happens that from my perspective, I think God does answer questions much better than the non-God position. So it's not an issue of hiding behind it. I'm willing to tell you what my entire worldview is. You are willing to tell me what your worldview is. Many people don't, because they don't want to defend a specific point, in some cases. So I don't think
I don't have
it's
such problem
relevant
with that.
to the debate. Good. Well, good. Yeah. And I appreciate that. I really do. So I have no problem letting people know what I believe, and then they could ask the questions and we can engage in internal worldview critique. So I'm not hiding behind something. And I do understand, as you probably would agree, there are some people who do hide their position so that they don't have to defend what they defend. It just so happens in this discussion, we're not doing that.
Fair enough, and I do appreciate the honesty there. If there's one thing that I don't like, it is a slippery interlocutor, as it were. Not because it gets very hard to pin them down on things, but because it's very difficult to actually have a discussion at that point.
Right.
Okay, so the next question I had is: you said that no fact is neutral. Under my worldview, facts are definitionally neutral. It is how you use those facts. I guess this is because it's from a pragmatics perspective. So for me,
Right.
it's the usage of the facts that cause the facts to be either for or against any particular position. But I view facts personally as neutral. Could you clarify the statement, facts are not neutral?
In other words, me and you will understand the foundation of any fact in completely different ways, given the diametrical opposites of our worldview. Since God created everything on my worldview, every fact is what it is because God created that fact to be what it is. And so you don't hold to that. And so for me, there is no such thing as casting my worldview aside and then you casting your worldview aside and then just making sense out of this worldview independent piece of data. So I would deny the existence of brute facts. I don't think brute facts speak for themselves. I think facts only make sense within a worldview context. And so in that sense, I would say they're not neutral. We can't interpret a fact independent of an intellectual framework with which we use to interpret the fact.
Okay, so you don't view brute facts as a thing that exist in an abstract sense, mind you, not exist as in this has ontological value.
Uninterpreted facts.
Uninterpreted facts. Okay.
I don't.
So do you accept? I'm fairly certain you do, but do you accept axioms then?
Some axioms, yeah. Axioms are. It depends, because when you get into, I'm a presuppositionalist. When you get into presuppositionalism as an apologetic methodology, you have two branches between Cornelius Van Til and Gordon Clark. And I think a key distinction here is that Clark held that the Bible is the Word of God is his axiom. And he would define axiom as something that cannot be justified by appealing to something external to itself. Anyone could pick any axiom, and so there's no justification for it. He just thought that if you pick an axiom, it needs to be able to coherently build your worldview. Whereas on my perspective, I don't take axioms in that fashion. As a matter of fact, I rarely use the term axiom. I would use, and I kind of just use this myself, I don't know if there's actual technical terminology for this. I would say that I have an ultimate presupposition. Now, I think the faulty thing about how people understand presuppositions, can you still hear me?
I can still hear you just fine.
Okay, because I lost these AirPods. See, this ran out of battery, so I'm going to recharge this and switch between them.
Just so you know, these guys are only $20.
Okay,
so if you wanted to
thank
get
you
a
very
replacement
much.
that doesn't have a battery.
Okay, sounds good. So I would take my foundation not as an axiom, but as an ultimate presupposition. And I think there's a fault in people's understanding of a presupposition, and that there's a common understanding that presuppositions are assumptions without justification. And I deny that. If someone were to say that a presupposition is an elementary assumption without justification, what they're doing is actually implicitly rejecting the reality of transcendental argumentation. Since transcendental argumentations try to justify presuppositions, not by appealing to something external to itself, but by appealing to its transcendental necessity. Kind of like that example when I used logic. Deny it, and you demonstrate it, because logic must be something that's actual in order to deny.
It's a lot like when somebody says they think philosophy is useless.
Okay, I lost you, so 1 second here.
Okay.
Let me try something real quick, okay?
Sure thing.
Okay, 1 second here. I should have charged these bad boys. 1 second here.
Would have been good debate prep.
Okay, I could hear you. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Charge these things, so I could hear you now.
Cool, excellent. Okay, so my contention with that, from what's the best way to word this? From everything that I've studied in philosophy, there is no functional difference to me between a presupposition and an axiom. An unquestionable presupposition, from what I understand, is simply an axiom, because an axiom, all an axiom is a truism. It is a principle or a dictum, something that is regarded as being established, accepted, or self-evidently true. So if you presuppose God, you are saying that God is self-evidently true. He is justified in and of himself by simply being himself, correct?
Well, I would disagree with your understanding of the presupposition as seeing no functional difference between an ultimate presupposition and axiom. To say that there's just functionally no difference is to implicitly deny the validity of transcendental arguments. Because the very fact that an ultimate presupposition, my ultimate presupposition, and not just this presupposition of God, but say, for example, the assumption of logic, it is an ultimate starting point, but it is justified. It's just not justified in the same way some other presuppositions may be. So when if you try to justify a presupposition, but an ultimate presupposition, by a standard outside of itself, then that presupposition is no longer your ultimate standard. The ultimate standard is the thing by which you judge the validity of that prior presupposition.
You just cut out. I can't hear you anymore.
It is justified
There we go.
by an appeal to its own transcendental necessity. That's the difference. Now, I'm not sure
Okay,
how much
so
you've studied in this area. I would say that it's not the... Can you hear me still?
I can hear you now. There was about a 10-second gap where you cut out.
But I can't hear you. So, oh my goodness. I'm so sorry. Let me see something for a second.
Audio quality is the episode.
This. All right, 1 second. Can you... Let me try this real quick. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes, just very barely.
Okay, I'll just now I have you just coming through my iPad. Okay, sorry. So I would make a distinction. I don't think there's functionally no difference between a presupposition, as I'm understanding it, and an axiom, since axioms are not justified, but presuppositions can be transcendentally. To say that they can't is just to deny transcendental arguments.
Then if I can, well, I'm okay denying transcendental arguments. I mean, that's kind of
fellas,
what
I hear an echo. I hear echo, and Eli, your volume is real low.
Yeah, I think when Eli switched to his when he switched to his iPad, he switched to both the iPad's audio in and audio out. I see he's got a Yeti.
So technologically,
So you've got. So what you need to do is you need to plug your Yeti in, and use that as your audio in, and then have your iPad as an audio out, and then on your Yeti there's a little.
I'm only using an iPad.
Okay, so what was your Yeti plugged into?
So let me see something here. So can you hear me now?
Yes,
Does it
I
sound
can.
a little better?
That sounds
Yeah, that
infinitely
sounds
better.
way better.
Now I
Yeah.
can't hear you.
That's because you're. Okay, so can you translate a message to Eli for me? Because I think he can hear you.
I can hear you now. I can hear you now.
Okay, cool. Because the Blue Yeti actually has an audio in and audio out function. So when you plug it in, your computer will recognize it as a possible audio out, because your Yeti actually has a thing there for audio out.
Well, I'm using everything on my iPad, so I it's different here. So, but I can hear you fine. So if you want to continue, unless
Okay.
there's an echo.
I think
everything that sounds good. So, Chris, I'm gonna give you about when the interruption happened. You had about 30 to 40 seconds left.
Yeah, my timer says
30 seconds.
Yeah, my timer says
Okay.
30 seconds. I've been running one as well. Then I actually have one
cool.
question. One question for Eli. It's regarding the
Okay.
debate and not regarding the debate at the same time. Can you send me after this debate any reading that you have done on the nature of axioms versus presuppositions, so that I can read those? Because you're the first person that has tried to argue that axioms and presuppositions have any functional difference that I've seen.
Wow. Okay. I mean, have you ever studied the works of someone like Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bahnsen?
I have not, though I have several Calvinist friends who have, and I've had I'm not sure if you're familiar with RCA, for instance, Reformed Christian Apologist. He's an apologetic YouTuber as well. You guys you guys are both Calvinists. You might get along.
of my study here is through audio and things like that, and I wouldn't know which page, but I could give you resources where you can kind of see a presentation of a transcendental argument.
Yeah, if
so
you want to
kinda
send
see
that
what
to me,
they're doing.
I'll gladly digest it.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so do you want to continue that 30 seconds, Chris, or do you
No,
want
that
to
was
conclude it
that
with
was that was my 30 seconds. I wanted
Okay,
research
that was your
material
30
for
seconds.
post debate.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Okay, Eli, you got the second. Go for 10 minutes.
Okay, so so it seems to be that you hold to an epistemological perspective that seems to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, have the same logical outcome of something along the lines of Immanuel Kant, so that we can't know the noumena, we can only know perception. Is that your view?
That would be my view. I don't think that we can understand what is ontologically true through our perception, but we can get close enough to be able to function, and that's really all that we need to be able to do, in my perspective.
Okay, all right. So if we can't know perception, we can't know reality. And so do you see why I would think that as an epistemology, you don't have the preconditions for intelligibility? Kant's perspective, I would argue, is fallacious. It's kind of like he commits what some have called the nothing but fallacy, right? It's a fallacy because nothing but statements imply more than knowledge. Kant says he knows the data that gets to his brain is nothing but phenomena, but in order to know this, he would have to be able to see more than just the phenomena. In other words, in order to differentiate one thing from another thing, you have to be able to perceive where one ends and the other begins. So when he says we can't know anything about reality, he's actually making a statement about reality that, given his own principles, he couldn't know. And so, do you see the issue where you're saying we can't know reality, but you're in an objective sense, but you're actually making a claim that, well, we can only know perception?
I think it's fairly demonstrable that we can only know perception. For instance, we have a perception of free will, which I know that as a Calvinist you probably already have contentions with just on a basis of me uttering that. But for instance, we have a perception of free will. However, from what we've understood from brain scans, most of our decision making is done about 6 microseconds in the subconscious before we actually have a chance to make it in the conscious.
Is that the case? Is that the case, or is that the way we perceive it? Again, when you say those things about studies, it presupposes that we have knowledge that those studies reflect something that is true.
Again,
if you apply,
here's the nature of pragmatism and how it helps here. So with pragmatism, under pragmatism, what we find, if what we find has usage, if what we find has utility, then that is as far as it goes. That is as far as it need go. What we understand about the human brain is that things happen in the subconscious before they happen in the conscious, before you are perceptually aware, before you have perception of a decision that has been made. It has been made. Now, granted, for legal purposes, we still have to hold people culpable for their actions, regardless of any legal apologetic saying that, oh, well, the subconscious was in charge of that, not the conscious. But there are, as an example, for pragmatism, when we were looking at something like science, I said in my opening statement that pragmatism views science as a tool. It sees it through the lens of instrumentalism. As long as it is yielding results, and it's yielding consistent results, then it maintains utility, and then we continue using it, regardless of whether or not it can say anything about ontology in its purest form, which it one day might be able to. I don't know. I don't have that ability to
But if I can cut in, it still seems to me that on the pragmatic view, it's making knowledge claims that goes beyond what pragmatism allows for. I mean, on the one hand, you claim that we can't know anything about the real world because we use these things pragmatically. Well, on the other hand, asserting that we can know the real world is unknowable in that way, or make any statement, well, perhaps we can know in the future. You're still making knowledge claims that even themselves are not objectively true necessarily.
Are they knowledge claims or are they belief claims?
Well, if you believe them, then why should anyone believe them to be true? On that worldview, you don't have preconditions for knowledge because it seems as that on your worldview you can't have knowledge. You're not concerned with true beliefs. You're concerned with what works. But then we could ask the question: is it objectively true that pragmatism seeks after what works? You still are stuck in a need for objective truth, which your view seems to not allow.
So there's 2 types of objective truth we're dealing with here. You're talking about objective truth about an abstract principle. So what pragmatism as an epistemology is concerned with is an abstract principle, because I cannot hold pragmatism in my hand in the same way that I cannot hold one in my hand, or I cannot hold purple in my hand. I can hold facsimiles of these concepts, but I cannot hold the actual thing in my hand. The ontologically true or false nature of a proposition is not the same thing as the ontologically true nature of, say, the exact chemical makeup of my desk, for instance. That's something that even if I were to be able to break down to the quark, there's still things below that I don't know. There's still parts about reality of this desk that I do not know. Whereas the truth value of a proposition is in a different category.
Is it objectively true that it's in a different category?
Again, we have to go to the fact that we're dealing with propositions. Propositions are not the same thing as the ontological nature of reality. These are things that we have built up in our own conversations. For instance, is it ontologically true that Superman can fly, as an example? Well, no, but within the reality that's been built around the character of Superman, yes. So is it ontologically true that pragmatism says A or B? Well, no, there's no ontological value to it. But within the framework of pragmatism, then we can make that statement.
Is it objectively true that within the framework of pragmatism we can make those statements?
You can dial this back 1,000 times. The answer is going to be the same.
That's right, and I would, but
because the game.
I apologize because.
Well, don't apologize, because I understand what the game here is, and I'm not saying that you're gaming me.
I don't worry about it. You don't have to just. I understand. You're a nice enough guy. I understand. We're just having a conversation.
This is basically a hyper application of the Socratic method. Is what this?
I'm really not thinking along those terms. I'm just thinking of trying to consistently apply a pragmatic outlook. On the one hand, we can't know objective reality, yet you're making statements when you make reference to scientific studies or anything like that. It seems to me that that's inconsistent with a pragmatic approach.
So
if we can't know objective reality, then you can't really make any statements that
regardless
reflect reality unless you're just saying they're just useful.
So here's the thing:
infinite regress. That's why I keep asking.
When you go into this infinite regress, when you start getting to the point of infinite regress, that's usually where pragmatism will stop, because an infinite regress does not have utility. It does not have explanatory power. It lacks utility. For instance, when we are talking about, I understand you think you've got me in a gotcha. I see that look on your face.
I just wanted to ask a question there. When you said that an infinite regress has no utility, well, it does have utility if, by pointing that you're stuck in an infinite regress, it shows the futility of that view as being a sufficient epistemological perspective that can ground knowledge and everything else within one's worldview.
Mm-hmm.
That's the utility of going through the infinite regress, not like what some presuppositionalists say. Well, how do you know that's true? How do you know that's? I'm not trying to do that as kind of a got you. I'm trying to consistently apply on that perspective. That is a problem. The infinite regress is a problem within pragmatism, which, as I perceive it, makes it an insufficient epistemological position to hold as a grounding for knowledge. So if, on your view, we can't have knowledge, and you can correct me if you do believe in some way we can, then my original argument is true, that the non-Christian position, your specific version of it, does not have the preconditions for knowledge, given the truth of your own perspective.
Under pragmatism, it would also be argued that nobody has the preconditions for knowledge. It's not just that the pragmatist does not have this ability. It's that everybody lacks the ability to do this. Under, for instance, one of the things that was brought up was, as long as something has utility, we keep it. And there seems to be issues with that. But as an example, you are speaking to me through a microphone that is currently connected to an iPad, that is currently being ran by a logical processor, and that logical processor is a direct result of pragmatic thinking. Regardless of the ontological value of anything in that. No, actually, historically, that's true. Check it out.
Well,
logical processors were actually originally invented by pragmatists. I'm not kidding you.
That's fine. What I'm getting at is when you say that we can't, you're saying that in the pragmatic approach, everyone's in this position. Again, given pragmatism, you're not in a place to know that this is everyone's situation. Again, you're making statements that go beyond what pragmatism allows. If you're a pragmatist and we can't have objective
pragmatism
reality,
is an epistemology.
One second, it's still my time, so I just want to ask this question.
Mm-hmm.
On a pragmatic epistemology, how can you make the sweeping statement that everyone is in the same position? That just begs the question in favor of your position. We can't know reality, so how can you know what other people are able to do in regards to epistemological issues? That's my question.
So the answer to that would be, as far as pragmatism is concerned, it is useful to be able to make the statement that it seems to be the case that everybody's stuck in the same boat, but it is also equally useless to operate under the condition that nobody can perceive reality. And again, you're dealing with an epistemology, which is about personal theories of truth, personal theories and beliefs, and trying to juxtapose that to ontology, which is about the case of things ontologically in the world.
I would say that everything that we do,
Eli,
our worldview, necessarily.
Eli, that's time right there. That's time right there. That's time right there.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks,
so
Chris.
Now, go ahead, Chris.
There's not that much time to answer and go back and forth. So thank you.
Yeah, 10 minutes is small, but that's fine.
All right, Chris, you have 10 minutes to go for it.
Sure thing. I'm actually going back on my notes here. So when you say that an argument is transcendental, transcendental arguments argue what must be the case in order for something else to be the case. Is that not a type of misapplication of the principle of entailment, where if you say one thing must be the case for another thing to be the case, do you have a way of actually demonstrating that is, again, the case at that point?
Yeah, when I deal with issues of transcendental argumentation, it asks what are the preconditions. In other words, there are things that must be true in order for us to have this conversation. For example, logic must be applicable, universal principles, in order for us to even have a coherent conversation. Now, if one wants to, someone says, well, I don't believe in logic, demonstrate it for me. The very denial of
that
logic,
person's going to make me angry.
Well, yes, that's true. And you'd be surprised. I've actually heard people who actually do deny logic. But the point still goes that to deny logic, you've actually demonstrated it. Why? Because transcendental arguments are proven by the impossibility of the contrary. Deny them, and the person's position is reduced to absurdity, just like the person who would deny the existence of logic. So when we're talking about transcendentals, they are proven by the impossibility of the contrary. Deny them, and you've demonstrated them. Affirm them, and you're still, the point is made either way. That's why they're so important, because
does that not sound somewhat circular to you, though? That literally makes it to where you have a position that has no ability to even be falsifiable, because the contrary is impossible.
Right. So when we say something is necessarily true, then it's non-falsifiable. So I would say logic is necessarily true, and by definition is unfalsifiable. Try to falsify it, and you demonstrate its truth, because you need to presuppose it in order to do that.
Yeah, you need to utilize logic in order to undermine logic.
That logic is invalid. You're going to have to give me an argument which presupposes logic, and then you'd be demonstrating the very point I'm making.
Okay. So when we're dealing with the transcendental arguments, the issue that this is not an issue that they present, but in the questioning, you end up reducing the opponent's argument to an infinite regress or an ad infinitum. And then I would assume in your worldview, God is used as the terminator for that regress, correct?
That is correct.
The ability of God to terminate the infinite regress comes from omnipotence.
Right.
Or just
I
from
would
his
say
existence.
that God is the stopping point. If you don't have a stopping point, then you run into the risk of an infinite regress, and you'll never be able to justify anything that's built upon that, because you can't build something upon something without a foundation.
Okay. So then my question is, if you're going to use God as a foundation there, and we're going to argue that you would argue that he is self-evident, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So on the proposition that God is sufficiently self-evident, do you not see how that causes a bit of a uniqueness problem?
What do you mean by uniqueness problem?
So the uniqueness problem comes down to he is unique in and of himself, We have no way of
Mm-hmm.
understanding without extra means that he exists because of his uniqueness. For instance, I have no way of knowing that a tree, like if there's only one tree in existence, as an example, I have
Mm-hmm.
no way of knowing that that tree exists unless I see that one tree. Otherwise, I have to have a reference point to find that one tree. This is the uniqueness principle. If only one of this thing exists, and there's no way for us to compare it to any other thing that is like it, because there's nothing like it, then we have to have some way of determining that it's there. So, if God is self-evident, how do we actually establish that he's self-evident? It seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that we would need Scripture in order to show that he is self-evident. But if we require Scripture to understand that God is self-evident, then doesn't that now mean that he is no longer self-evident, because we have required Scripture in order to even get to a belief claim on God, who is supposedly self-evident?
Right. Right. That presupposes that knowledge of God is mediate, that we need to look and conclude, oh, look, there's God. If we grant the Christian perspective, the knowledge of God is both mediate and immediate. We can know God by, if you're familiar with the verse, the heavens declares the glory of God, but also knowledge of God is immediate in that man is creating the image of God. And so that very image, the very thinking process, makes man, in a sense, aware of God. Now we get into some theological issues of, and again, this part gets, most skeptics find this insulting. But the Christian position, as I said at the beginning, teaches that in some way, if we can kind of work our way and discuss this issue of self-deception, in some way, all men know that God exists. Again, you don't have to agree with that, but that's the Christian position, and that knowledge of God is actually innate. Scripture is more specific knowledge, and so we would make a distinction there between general revelation and special revelation. But general revelation includes not only knowledge of God mediated through our observing, but it's also knowledge of God immediately, in that the very fact that we're created in his image. It's kind of like what John Calvin says, that we cannot understand, when we understand ourselves, knowledge of God and knowledge of man is simultaneous. We can't know ourselves unless we, in some sense, know God. So it's an immediate knowledge of God, not necessarily something that we draw a conclusion to.
Okay. And then my next question would be, do you view, I supposed earlier in one of my arguments that you would view God as the foundation of good, not as separate from good, as Euthyphro would put. Is that the case?
Right. God's nature, the goodness reflects God's nature. So God is good by the very definition of who he is.
Can God do anything outside of his nature?
No.
Okay, so he is bound by his nature.
That's just saying he just does what he does. Yeah.
Well, no, you said he cannot. Not he will not. He cannot. Would you like to clarify?
Right. God can't do something that is out of accord with who he is. So yeah. That's a biblical position. For example, the Bible says that God can't lie. It would be logically impossible for a perfectly holy and good God to do that which is not perfect and holy. So I would say that he acts consistently with who he is. To act outside of his nature would be a contradiction in terms.
Okay.
And as I'm sure you would understand, you probably heard some Christian apologists say this, and I'm in agreement, that God doesn't do the logically impossible. And I wouldn't say that that's a detriment to his omnipotence, because the logically impossible is not a thing. It's just a conglomeration.
I agree with you on this. I actually have a video on my channel called The Worst Arguments Against God, and the first one I bring up is the argument from the stone, basically saying that please stop using this argument. It's horrible.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, that would be my response. God does anything consistent with his nature, and he doesn't do anything that's contrary to his nature.
Doesn't do anything contrary to his nature. Okay. And you would agree that he is omnipotent and all-loving, correct?
What do you mean by all-loving?
All-loving, as I defined earlier, that he has unconditional love for his creation. He has agape love.
I would say that God loves his creation, but there are different degrees within his love. He doesn't love everyone in precisely the same way.
Okay. Is there a verse that you can reference to where he says that?
Yes, as a deduction from Scripture. For example, we have the idea of the hatred of God. In Psalm 5, it says, I hate the worker of iniquity. But then in another sense, there's a sense in which God does love the world, but that sense is qualified by those other statements which we tried in Scripture that we try to hold consistently.
Okay,
so there's a way in which God hates.
So it's not unconditional love. Because there are
I mean,
conditions that you've just set up.
I'm sorry.
Because there are conditions and qualifiers.
I haven't set up any conditions.
In
The Bible
in
teaches
conversation. In conversation, you have
Okay.
set them up. Not that they were set up by you in particular,
Okay.
but within the conversation.
Right. I would say that in the scriptures themselves, God himself differentiates his love. You have explicit scriptures which talk about his specific and special love for his covenant people. You have scriptures that talk about his general love for mankind, but it's not a kind of redemptive love. We talk about in theology this idea of common grace. That is an expression of a kind of love, but it's definitely not the same kind of love that God has for his elect. So there is differentiation within the Bible itself. And so since the Bible is my standard, the basis upon which I formulate these ideas, that's consistent within my perspective.
Okay.
If anyone tries to define omnibenevolence in some way that's contrary to that, I would just say that such a conception would be contrary to my worldview and wouldn't apply to me.
Okay. Then my next question would be, what is your view on hell?
Eternal conscious torment.
Eternal conscious torment.
Right.
And
but I understand that Christians within the realm of orthodoxy hold to a wide range of views on that. This happens to be my view. So my view, I'm convinced that this is the correct way. But I have conversations with people about different perspectives.
That's why I didn't declare what your version of hell was when I was speaking earlier.
Sure.
I recognize there's several versions of hell that have been posited, and a lot of them end up stemming from, for instance, the Apocalypse of Peter, which was then extrapolated into Dante's Inferno, and that gave us our very like Southern Baptist-y version of hell. Whereas the Bible itself is somewhat vague in many of its passages when dealing with hell.
All right, that's time.
Okay.
All right, Eli, you have 10 minutes. Your final 10 minutes to cross-examine Chris.
Okay. Let me see here. Okay, we talked about love. You have a philosophical agnosticism, so that's consistent with your pragmatism because you admitted that we can't know objective reality. Let me see where I would go from here. I mean, it's very difficult to say. I guess I could ask. I'm still convinced that your position of pragmatism within your worldview perspective, if it's true, would you agree that within your worldview you don't have the preconditions to know objective reality, and so your view is skeptical about everything? We really can't know anything in its reality, just perception.
So it sounds. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the argument from the ass. And
I'm not familiar with the argument.
This is actually an old Greek argument. I'm not kidding.
I believe you.
So the argument from the ass states, this is important for this. The argument from the ass is an argument against skepticism. The ass as a donkey is stuck between two piles of feed. And the piles of feed are equidistant. They are equal sized. So the donkey is skeptical on which one it should eat. The donkey basically cannot pull an ought from the is of the current situation, which is a giant problem that everybody has issues with. You can't pull an ought from an is in any situation. Because the donkey cannot figure out which pile it should eat from, the donkey starves due to its skepticism and its inability to know which side it needs to go. The donkey ends up dying. So with pragmatism, there's a conversation where skepticism is concerned. So you do have a level of skepticism towards essentially everything. If somebody tells me one thing that they believe or one thing they think is true, I will probably look it up without taking their word on it, which pisses a lot of my friends off. That's unfortunate for them. I'm sorry. But in that skepticism, pragmatism also holds that there is no utility in not taking a position. This is why I didn't begin this by taking a non-position, something that, again, thank you for having a modicum of respect for. Pragmatism would hold that there's no utility in taking that non-position or not actually acting. So, pragmatically, the donkey would have to choose, regardless of there being a good or worse option, would have to choose one of the two sides. So yes, in that skepticism, we can't know something ontologically, but in pragmatism, we must still act, because without action, there is no utility.
Okay, but the story of the ass presupposes the objective reality that the ass exists. So if we can't know anything about objective reality, then my next question would be, do you know that you exist?
Can you operate under beliefs alone?
I'm sorry.
Can you operate
It's
under
my turn to ask the question, so I'm just asking the question. Given your perspective,
Okay.
if we can't know objective reality, then can someone know objectively that they exist? If you can know objectively that you exist, then you can know some aspect of objective reality, which would refute the idea that we can't know objective reality.
Knowing
an
aspect about objective reality does not mean that you know objective reality. You've been able to pull an aspect of it from your perception, which has marginal utility. It may be closer in proximity to the ontological truth of the matter, but it does not necessitate that you have actually gotten close enough to perceive the ontological truth of the matter. My position is that one can operate entirely on belief alone. Those beliefs can lead them to knowledge, possibly. Whether they know that they actually have knowledge, as much of a tautology as that statement is a bit hard to perceive, but a being, just in general, can operate purely on belief, especially if they have to make action.
But you did say just then that we could move closer to the ontology. But how would you know we would be moving closer to the ontology, since we can't know, on your view?
You have no way of knowing,
reality.
but it doesn't matter.
I'm sorry?
You have no way of knowing, but it doesn't matter. For instance, if I am closer to what the ontological value of graphite is, what it actually is in general, that neither helps nor hinders, and in many cases it may hinder, because it will throw me into the problem of the ass of unfettered skepticism, essentially. I have no way of knowing the ontological value of every single facet of the chemical makeup of this graphite, but I recognize that this graphite has utility. It can be used to write. It can be used for several other experiments that can be used in other instances. So you don't keep going and hit that infinite regress. You go until you get to the point where, okay, this has now become absurd. If you get to the point where it feels like it's becoming absurd, then there's no reason to continue forward at that point. This is why pragmatism is commonly used as an answer to solipsism.
Right, and I don't think it's a good argument, because my point is that pragmatism does reduce to absurdity, since on the one hand you're positing pragmatism, but then you make claims that look like knowledge claims, but then you have to admit that's not knowledge. Your worldview seems to not be able to provide the preconditions for knowledge. I mean, even by saying, well, we could only just know perception, that's a knowledge claim. And you say, well, I don't know if that's objectively true. Well, that's a knowledge claim. I don't see how you could avoid the infinite regress. If infinite regression is absurdity, then I would say that's what seems that your worldview goes down that route. That's why I'm I'm trying my best to understand what you're saying, but it seems as though you're proving my point in my initial argument, that to reject a worldview that has the foundation that I'm suggesting, the position is reduced to absurdity. If your position is pragmatism, you got the infinite regress. If your position is empiricism, you got problems there. If your position is rationalism, there's problems there. So I put those out as red meat just to, and I'm glad you clarified, you didn't take any of those. You said, well, I'm a pragmatist, and that helps narrow things down. But it seems that position, really, you can't make any certain claims about anything, even that pragmatism is something useful, because that's an objective knowledge claim. How would you respond to that?
My response to that would be we would have to look at what the fruits of that particular epistemology are. So under pragmatism, under pragmatic thought, we have, as an example, I hate the word scientism, and I hate people who adhere to science being the end-all be-all to everything. I can't stand that. Science doesn't get you to ethics, as an example. There's a reason we have a separate category for ethics of science. But under pragmatism, we can see things like philosophy of science, instrumentalism, and we can see these things and we can determine their utility. So how do we determine the utility of, say, alchemy versus science? Well, we look at its fruits. Well, how do we determine the utility of pragmatism versus, say, solipsism? Well, we look at its fruits. If solipsism naturally would beget somebody who operates as if they are the only living being on the planet and everything else is a manifestation of their mind, in hard solipsism, the type of person that is begot from that largely doesn't have any utility behind anything they do. They don't have a reason to do anything for anybody else except, say, feed themselves, because they're the only one they can even figure that exists. But even then, the food that they're consuming might not exist. Under pragmatism, though, you still have to actually go into action. So the fruits of pragmatism end up outweighing the fruits of something like solipsism.
Right, but the fruit is not something that is known objectively. It's a perception of what that fruit is. And so
Sure.
we can have skepticism literally about everything that we perceive to be the fruit and utility of something. Right, and so that position would destroy the possibility of knowing anything at all.
And there's nothing wrong with that. A being can operate entirely on beliefs.
Do you know that to be true?
I believe it to be true, and I can operate on that.
Right, but you see the infinite regress. I could ask you, do you know that you believe that to be true? It's going to keep going back because that's
Can you
the nature
explain what the problem of
worldview
an infinite regress is?
I'm sorry?
Can you explain what the actual issue of an infinite regress is? Because I don't actually see
if
one.
I were to say, why do you believe, A? And you say, well, because of this. And I was like, why do you believe that? Because of this. Why do you believe that? Because of this. And you continue to go ad infinitum, then you have never justified how you actually know the initial thing. Infinite regression will destroy the possibility of understanding anything because you could never have a justification, a stopping point that actually grounds that. You'd go on forever and never know anything, which if that's true, that position is reduced to absurdity, since you'd have to say, on that view, okay, we can't know anything. But if you can't know anything, how do we know we can't know anything? That position is self-refuting. And so I would see that position as an absurd position, unless you have some kind of stopping point that can ground those beliefs and give a proper justification for them. I think the Christian worldview can do that.
See, I don't necessarily see there's being an issue with not having a stopping point.
That's time right there for Eli's 10 minutes, final 10 minutes. All right, Chris, you now can question Eli for your final 10 minutes.
Sure. So for my final 10 minutes, I want to get into the concept of hell for a little bit. So you brought up that your version of hell is eternal conscious torture. So this is something that a being would be able to perceive till the end of time. And what is your definition of torture that you're using for this?
I don't know. The description of hell is where the difficulty comes for me. I know people have different ideas of what hell actually entails. To be quite honest, based on my own study, I'm not sure in what way the people suffer. I know one aspect of the suffering is being eternally separated from God, and so that is going to be a part of it. But in regards to the details, I'm not so sure, and that's a conversation that I'd like to have with my fellow Christians to kind of explore that a little more.
Okay, but you do view it as suffering of a nature, correct?
Oh, yes, okay. Very much so.
All right, then it doesn't actually matter. I would argue that it doesn't matter then what type of suffering it is. Because regardless of if the suffering is burning forever or being tickled forever or having a graphite pencil slowly pushed into your ear but never quite penetrating all the way through forever, these are all forms of suffering, unless somebody's got a weird kink that I'm not entirely certain of and would maybe question. So my position would be that it doesn't matter what type of torture it is or what type of suffering. All suffering is equal if it's infinite, because there's not going to be any difference between one type of suffering or another if they're infinite. Just like all type of happiness.
I would disagree with that. I would disagree with that.
You can see a functional difference between suffering if it's infinite.
Well, I would argue that there may be some indication within the Bible that discusses different degrees of punishment, so that people in hell are all punished, but there are different degrees. Now, what does that look like? I don't know. Only God knows the degree and the degree that's appropriate for the person. But I don't see that that's necessarily the case. That it's just all the same.
So, the reason I say that it's all the same, from a finite amount of time, we perceive any type of suffering that we have based on the degree of suffering that we have and the length of time we have in that type of suffering, which will increase the degree of suffering. For instance, if you're familiar, I'm not sure how familiar you are with like old school military torture methods, but many of them.
I have gandered in the Encyclopedia of Torture. I don't know. There's actually an encyclopedia that goes into different torture methods throughout history. So I have dabbled a little bit out of curiosity, but go ahead.
Okay. So what we find when we look at torture methods that have been used throughout history, many torture methods, and some of the most psychologically damaging ones, are ones that we would consider mundane if they were done for a short period of time. For instance, dripping water on somebody's forehead for an amount of time while they're strapped down. This is considered a relatively mundane thing to endure for even 10 minutes. However, when we extend this torture to a long amount of time, for instance, an hour, a day, a handful of days, we find that the torture actually gets magnified greatly to the point where it is equivalent to, if not worse than, other types of more violent, brutal torture. So my position is that if someone is suffering, if that suffering is infinite, all suffering eventually will reach a point where it is indistinguishable in the amount of tautology as it is. I would say torture, actually. You used conscious torture. This is fine. Any type of torture of any kind will result in the same amount of suffering if the amount of time allowed is infinite, because there is no end point. They will all reach the same point and continue on past that point infinitely.
Well, I mean, you're saying all these things. I'm not committed to those understandings from my worldview. And if you're saying that from your worldview, you're not even sure that that's objectively true, since within your worldview, you can't know that. You perceive that that's how things work and how these things would have various logical entailments. I'm not obligated within my worldview to understand the things the way you've just described them.
Okay, and that's fine that you're not obligated to. So then my next question would be, do you view God as all good? Any action that he takes would be good?
Yes.
Okay, and so you view him... Do you view that there are people who are predestined to go to hell? They are born and they will be going to hell, period. They are simply not elect, they are reprobate.
Yes.
Okay, and do you view that as just, that these people were born never having a chance to actually be saved?
Well, we're going to have to get into some theological weeds there, which is fine. If we were, discussing theology as an entire conversation, I wouldn't want to imagine to get into the details of that here.
Well, it was
However,
a yes/no question.
I'm sorry?
Well, it was a yes/no question. Do you view it as just?
Well, it's yes or no questions can be pretty tricky because I'd want to qualify certain things. But if you're asking within my worldview, and you're asking, is something fair? Even if I didn't know how it would be fair, if I were to say it's fair, which I think it is, since God always does good, it is a good thing. Even if I wouldn't be able to explain to you the details of all that, my worldview does not require me to go into the details and explain it. My worldview provides, my worldview within it is that everything that God does is good. Now, if I can't explain, well, how is this good? That's irrelevant to me having, or God having a sufficient reason, a good reason for why he's doing those things.
Okay.
So there's no inconsistency within my own perspective. I
wanted to catch you on a thing that you did there.
If God predestines people to hell, it's a good thing, and it's just because God did it. God doesn't do anything not just, and so it would logically follow that it is just. Now, if you were to respond with a question, but what about? Those are interesting in-house theological issues, but given the truth of my worldview, it would be just, and so there wouldn't be a logical problem there.
Okay, so there's two questions I want to ask on that. The first one is, do you recognize that you accidentally equivocated there?
Maybe, but I'd be happy. I mean, I'm not perfect. I'd love you to clarify.
So I used the word just, and you swapped to the word fair. Are you? I'm fairly certain that you're using these interchangeably.
Yes. I did. To answer your question, I did recognize that I equivocated. So yes.
So you recognize that just refers to an action that's justified under its particular circumstances. It can also be defined as a suspension of mercy. Fair refers to an action that treats people as they deserve to be treated. Many times actions are just, but they are simply not fair. Many times actions are fair, but there is no justice in their fairness. So swapping these words
I would clarify.
put you in a weird place.
So thank you. I did equivocate. So kind of just responding and thinking off the top of my head. I would say that everything God does in regards to exercising his justice, he is right in doing so, and it is truly the just thing to do, whatever he does.
Okay. So then we recognize that under that worldview, should he elect, I know you're a father, should he elect to take one of your children and say that they are not elect, they are doomed to suffer for eternity, and there's nothing that you or anyone else can do about it, no matter how hard they try, do you see that as a just action?
Well, I would say that God is free to elect anyone he pleases, and so what I think is irrelevant to whether that's just or not. Now, we do make a distinction within Reformed theology between God's decrees and secondary causes and things like that. And so we do not believe within our worldview that our actions don't matter. Now, we could get into the intricacies of those things, and then we'll just be opening up theological issues, which is fine. But given my worldview, God is free to predestine anyone, and he is free to send everyone to hell if he wants, and he's free to send everyone to heaven, and he has the freedom to do that. It's irrelevant what I think.
So
God can predestine my children from before the foundation of the world to go to hell if he sees fit.
Okay. And you are perfectly fine worshiping this God that would condemn your children to eternal punishment and not give them a choice in the matter.
Within my worldview, I don't understand the things in the simplistic way that we just kind of did that exchange. Within my worldview, I agree that God is just. He has morally sufficient reasons for what he allows and what he does, whatever, what he permits, what he causes. And I would say that in order for me to say that that's wrong, I'd have to presuppose something inconsistent with my worldview, namely an external standard of good that I perceive God not to be acting in accord with. Now, I do believe that when God saved me, the Bible teaches that my actions do matter in some way. And so I do bring my children up in the admonition of the Lord. And the Bible says that God ordains not only the ends, but the means. And so I see my actions as very important. So it's not this issue of, well, God, could have predestined my children to hell, so how could you worship a God like that? Well, it's more complex than that. If you read some of the Christian creeds, we go into some of the details of the relationship between God's sovereign decrees and human actions and their importance.
Okay.
All right. That is the end of the cross-examination portion of this debate. With that, I do have two questions, if you guys don't mind. Sort of like a little Q&A, if you will. So the first question is for Eli. Like a lot of arguments from the skeptical world, the skeptical position has to do with the moral standing, question the morality of God, right? So the understanding is, if God is all-loving, he's holy, why not just wipe out evil altogether? What's the purpose of, for example, allowing someone to be raped? Something like that.
Yeah,
and I picked the most extreme. I picked the most extreme one because that's typically where they
rape
go.
And all that stuff. That's torturing babies for fun. This is the kinds of stuff we need to talk about because I think the most intense examples bring out the point. I think, and that's why I think people talk about these things. We have to understand that my inability to know God's morally sufficient reason for allowing something is irrelevant to the fact that God has morally sufficient reason to do so. Deuteronomy 29:29 says that the secret things belong to the Lord, and those that he's revealed belong to us and our children's children. So within the Christian worldview, it's consistent for me to not necessarily know why God does certain things. But because God has also revealed his goodness, there is sufficient ground within Scripture itself that I can trust that those areas of life that I don't understand, God does in fact have morally sufficient reasons for allowing them. So when you say, why did God allow a rape or a murder? My inability to know God's reason is irrelevant to the fact that God has morally sufficient reasons. He may tell us. There might be instances in Scripture where he explains why a specific evil occurred. And then there are instances where he doesn't explain. Within my worldview, God's not obligated to explain. I'm just happy that when certain bad things happen, he does explain some of it. So that's not an issue in terms of the truth of my perspective. There's no logical incoherency within my perspective. My perspective grants that I won't know always God's morally sufficient reasons.
Okay, Chris, you got thoughts on that?
Only one thought. I just find it very interesting that my interlocutor's position, for better or worse, is that it's perfectly okay when rape happens because God has a reason for it to happen.
That's not what I said, but okay.
Well, that's the principle of entailment. God has a plan. Everything happens within his plan.
Now you're imposing how you understand those issues onto my perspective. Within my worldview, it would be inappropriate for me to say that God is okay with rape. Just because God permits evil doesn't mean that he's okay with it. God permits certain things and he is accomplishing purposes, but not everything that he permits he's okay with. But he definitely has purposes for why it's allowed. And of course, God will one day, within the Christian perspective, judge people for their sinful actions. So,
But he won't stop it.
I think that would be a straw man to understand my position as it's okay for someone to be raped.
Okay, Chris, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned you spoke about God's agape love, his unconditional love.
Mm-hmm.
Is it right? Okay, so this is okay. So I'm sort of leading to the question a little bit. If we have a God, right? We have a God who's all loving, all powerful, and he's just in his actions. Is not he allowed to show wrath in the same way that he shows love, or is it just that we look at the agape love and we say, well, the agape love wouldn't allow this. The agape love wouldn't send anybody to hell. Is he not allowed, just like we do as parents? I'm not sure if you have children, Chris, but as we do as parents, there's a time where we love our children, but there's also a time where we have to discipline them. We have to put them on punishment and so forth. Do you not think that an almighty God, an all just God, has the right to love and also lay down the hammer, if you will?
So there's a couple answers to this. The first one, we have to deal with what types of wrath are enacted in the here and now, and then what types of wrath are enacted in the afterlife. If we're talking about the here and now, we run into the issue of we're seeing God essentially as a parent who's using punitive action as a teaching mechanism. Would you say that that's somewhat correct?
Sure.
Okay. So when punitive action is used as a teaching mechanism, there's a lesson to be learned at the end. So when you use punitive action as a parent, you typically communicate why something happened. For instance, your child steals something from the grocery store. You find out, you spank them, you let them know that, hey, just so you know, what I did to you right now was infinitely less bad than what would happen to you in the penal system. I'm letting you know right now that the action that you did was wrong. You need to take that back to the store, and you use it as a teaching method. The purpose of punitive action here is to teach. When we're dealing with God's wrath on earth, it's very hard for many of those actions to be seen as teaching mechanisms because there is not the follow-up from the parent that, hey, the reason I did this is this. It's up to the person's perception here. We don't ask children we don't spank a child and then basically just say, you know what you did and you know why it's wrong. We can't do that until we've actually sat down and explained that to the child. Secondly, if we're dealing with the issue of the afterlife, I view the punitive action of God at this point, again, depending on which version of hell you're using, as largely useless. Because if we're going to view punitive action as a method of teaching someone a lesson, there's no lesson to be learned once you're in hell. Because if you're there, it doesn't matter if you learn your lesson or not. There's nothing you can do with it at that point. You can't then take that lesson and be a better person. You can't use that in any other area. So it seems to me that when we're dealing with hell, the afterlife punishment, we have punishment for punishment's sake. And I view neither of those, the punishment without communication and the punishment for punishment's sake, I don't view any of those as congruent with the type of punishment we would use on our children as a parent for teaching purposes.
Okay. Eli, what you got to say?
Yeah, I wouldn't equate God's wrath necessarily with how it was just expressed there. And basically, you're asking the question, Chris, from your perspective, wouldn't God have a right to punish and bring down the hammer? Again, he's going to have to answer that in two ways, either from his own worldview perspective or from within the Christian worldview perspective. If he's answering within the Christian worldview perspective, then he's going to have to grant the truth of the perspective and on its own terms answer that question, which I don't think he did. If he's answering it from his own perspective, then there's the problem of his pragmatic epistemology. If we can't know objective reality, how does he know the objective truth of everything he just said? If he admits that he doesn't know those things to be true, then he really hasn't said anything. If he says he can know those things to be true and how we're to understand wrath, then his view is false, since he's claiming to have objective knowledge as to those categories that he's just delineated between and regarding the different kinds of wrath and punishment and correction and lessons to be learned.
Okay. Well, you guys are in luck. I only got 2 questions for you. So,
Well, I would like to say this was an enjoyable discussion.
Okay,
Same
cool.
here.
Right.
And I really appreciate, I don't know if we're done, if we're doing closing statements or whatever, but just to say beforehand, I'm not saying this superficially. I really did enjoy this conversation. I find you to be a respectful debate partner.
Excellent.
I find you to be the same.
Excellent, excellent. I'll transition to, if you guys want to say something in closing, go ahead and give you guys a chance to close, and then we'll close this debate out. We'll close the show out. All right, Eli, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to go ahead and give some closing remarks.
All right, well, just to summarize, my argument at the beginning was that the Christian worldview provides the necessary preconditions for intelligibility. All non-Christian perspectives lack that foundation. The non-Christian perspectives either are internally incoherent or undermine human, let me see if I can find the specific words. They undermine human reasoning and experience. And I think, given the pragmatic approach, I think we see that once you grant the hypothetical truth of pragmatism, human reasoning and experience is in fact undermined, since you can't make any objective statements about reality. Yet, on the one hand, I think the pragmatist does run amok and does make these statements about objective reality. You have to actually presuppose, the opposite of what you're actually saying. So, on the one hand, we can't know everything, or anything objectively, and on the other hand, there are statements being made that presuppose that we can know certain things objectively. And so, I think that is a detriment to the pragmatist perspective. Now, again, we didn't get to hash out the details of my own worldview as it being transcendentally necessary. Again, that's probably due to the time frames and just the way the discussion flowed. But I do believe that the Christian worldview, its benefit is that it is true in a transcendental sense. Deny its metaphysic, its epistemology, and its worldview framework, and the position is reduced to absurdity. Now, of course, we didn't have time to go into the details of other worldview perspectives, but hopefully, I hope that in this discussion it was demonstrated that pragmatism doesn't have the legs to stand and build a coherent worldview foundation. That being said, and I'll close with this, as I said before, I definitely appreciate Chris coming on and interacting in a respectful manner, and my prayer for him is that he continues to look at these things and have discussions, which my prayer is that one day you will come to know the Lord Jesus Christ and have your sins forgiven, and that, that's my prayer for you. And I'm sure other people have said that, but I just want to share my heart there and wrap up my comments. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Eli, for those closing remarks. I appreciate it. All right, Chris, you got it.
Sure thing. My closing remarks would be, I still, obviously at the end of this, remain unconvinced that God is a thing, at least the Christian God is a thing. I was for 18 years, but that largely fell away. I've actually got videos on my channel dealing with that, but I'm not going to use this as an attempt to plug, because my opponent did not use this as an attempt to plug. So what I will say is this. I do not find, still, that whether or not we can perceive the ontological nature of reality as terribly important, as long as we can get close enough in approximation to garner utility. Again, we know that science, as an example, gets us closer to an approximation of ontological truth because of the fruits of its efforts, whereas something like alchemy does not get us closer to the ontological nature of truth, because alchemy largely over the centuries never yielded any fruit. Again, that's not to say that everything boils down to science. When we have arguments about morals and ethics, science can tell us how perception has developed around those things, but it can't necessarily give us any moral oughts to argue that it can is an ought from his problem. So at the end of the day, the only thing I want to say is I enjoyed this discussion with Eli, and even though we come out at completely opposite ends of the spectrum, I do enjoy the fact that he was a respectful interlocutor, because I have had many a debate where my interlocutor was certainly not that. So I did want to say that in closing.
All right. Thank you once again, both of you. Thank you for a well-rounded discussion. I appreciate the effort that you guys took in order to prepare for this, and just the openness and making your time available for something like this. These open discussions where people are able to come together and actually hear each other. And actually hear each other's arguments and be able to respond in a respectful, honorable manner is lacking in today's culture. So I really do appreciate it. And with that, I do want to bless both of you with gifts for coming on. So I will get with both of you after the show expires. I will get with both of you, and I will look for a contact or a place where I can send a gift. So with that said, once again, thank both of you. I appreciate both of you. And
hey all.
I'm going to close the show out and be on the lookout for more shows. I'm gonna try to get y'all doing somebody else, man. I might do a part 2 with this, man. This was a great conversation, so I appreciate you both.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. No problem.
One thing I wanted to say real quick, Eli, if you're here. Would you mind if in the group chat between you and Marlon, I dropped the worst arguments against God video that I did so you could give me your critique on that?
Let me see if I'm not really familiar with this, so let me see. I don't even know how to get to the comments. See, I'm
should just be the Facebook conversation that we had. I just dropped it in there.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, I'll take a look and yeah, cool. Thank you. I appreciate that.
No problem.
All right, fellas. See y'all soon, man. I'll close the show out.
Take care. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you, Chris, for engaging. I appreciate it.
No problem.
All right.
Take care.
All right, that is it, folks. The gospel truth, man. Hey, I love these conversations. I love the fact that, the platform that God has blessed me with is being used in order to engage, in order to engage those who do not agree with the Christian perspective. And in doing that, it's done in a manner that's great. That's awesome. And I just want to encourage all the Christians out there. When you engage with those who disagree with your position, you need to do it in a manner that's going to allow them to hear you. The condescending attitudes, the sarcasm, the emotional responses, all that does nothing. We need to be able to engage ourselves and represent our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in a manner that He's called us to represent Him. And once again, I just want to thank Eli and Chris for doing that. I want to thank these two individuals for coming on and doing a great job at arguing for their position. With that said, I do want to go into the gospel truth. The gospel truth is Jesus Christ's death, burial, and resurrection.
And with that, I think we're good. We're good hopping out. I don't think there's anything else to be pulled from there. Okay, with that said, I should probably go ahead and enable the camera thing, right? That's the thing I should do? Hold on, let me... where is it? Video capture device. Oh no. Properties. That should bring up an orange screen, and that should bring up me. Aha! I am back now. How's it going, guys? How's everyone? Sure. I am perfectly fine with a post-debate conversation with you, Ocean Kelboy. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm gonna go ahead and give you a call. Assuming that Ocean will answer. He doesn't really love me.
Yo, dog.
Hey, how's it going?
No, I'm not going to answer. I'm totally just fucking off.
No, fair enough. I figured as much.
So, how did you think that debate went?
I didn't get to press him as hard as I wanted to on some things, which made me sad because there was actually there were a few avenues I wanted to move in, specifically because I watched his conversation with Skylar Fiction, so I knew certain bullets that he would bite. He did bite a few of them that I was happy about. I just couldn't. Happy about in a very small sense. Not happy that this is actually the case of things. But he did bite the bullet that it would be just for his children to be sent to hell, which is disturbing for a parent to say. But
yeah, I saw that. He was like, "It's not up to me," kind of thing, and it was just like, well, I mean, that's consistent for a Calvinist, but
it's consistent for a Calvinist. But it's to me, it sounds functionally no different from a. Well, mein Führer said that mein Aunt was a Jew, so they get the gas.
God damn it!
Wow. I didn't really see. Do you see a difference between those positions?
Well, I don't. Oh, jeez. You get into whether or not the Führer is the ontological grounding of truth.
Mein Führer is mein Welt.
Right, you might be able to make that argument that that's what they're doing when they say something like that. The thing, my observation is that I saw you using my go to hell, God can go to hell argument a little bit. I wanted you to go further with that, but the format didn't really allow you guys to really have a conversation. It was just like
10
now
minutes
you
of
ask the questions, now you ask the questions.
Yeah,
there was
and
no conversation.
And when there were times where, like, when I earlier in the conversation I asked him, well, do you agree that that God creates color?
Right.
Because he tried to say that, do you agree that in the Christian
And you had
world...
to dodge the question as a result because he wouldn't answer the question.
Yeah,
so
I'm
the format and ran.
I'm just like, I have to, I'm sorry, but I have to sidestep your question. I don't want to dodge your question. I didn't dodge any questions in that conversation.
Right.
But I ended up having to dodge that question because my answer was contingent on whether or not he thinks that something like color exists. We operate as if color exists and it's functional, but we recognize that in the truest sense, color is not really a thing.
Can I make a point about something that I wish you'd chased down that wasn't touched that's foundational to his position?
Sure.
Okay. So the thing with a lot of presuppositionalists is that they think that their position justifies the laws of logic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Except just because, say, a pragmatist can't justify the laws of logic or can't demonstrate that something is objectively true or whatever. I think that he was talking about objective truth more than justifying laws of logic.
Mm-hmm.
But his method for justifying the laws of logic is how he claims he's got access to truth like that. That revelation is handed down from on high from deity in order for them to actually interpret the world.
His position on that, actually, I know. I've listened to his conversations with T-Jump, Skylar Fiction, and others. And his position, because I know that, like, Steve McRae has made the argument that, I presuppose my left sock. I think it's the way that he goes about it. And he says that, well, the difference between...
I've done this with Odin before, but yeah.
He says that, well, the difference between your position and mine is mine contains revelation. And that's why I tried to get into the issue of, well, if you're going to argue a transcendental argument, you're presupposing that God is self-evident, but there's no way to actually self-evidently ascribe anything to God without Scripture, and if you require Scripture, then it undermines self-evidency. But he was able to kind of step away from that. He didn't bite that.
He's stepping away from that by basically trying to appeal to the reality of God that is external to Scripture, which is due to special revelation. There's not a dependency on Scripture in that, so that I can see why he was able to dodge that very easily. The thing that winds up being the issue, though, is that presuppositionalists believe that they have justified the laws of logic through presupposing deity. The problem is that that doesn't actually get out of the problem. Just because the pragmatist can't justify the laws of logic or give accessibility to truth doesn't mean that the presuppositionalist can. And if you notice, what he was doing is he kept saying, well, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, therefore I'm right, when the shoe was never really put on the other foot of how do you demonstrate this? So he was appealing to the transcendental argument, but the transcendental argument presupposes the laws of logic.
The only
he has
reason
to justify the laws of logic, and if he justifies the laws of logic by presupposing again, it winds up in another infinite regress, which he's supposedly against, right?
The only problem I have, though, isn't trying to argue that, well, my position's not justified, neither is yours. Isn't that a bit of a tu quoque fallacy in arguments? I could be wrong.
No. I get it. The question is whether or not he's justified.
Got it. Okay, I can see how that works.
So, like, if he's saying you're not justified, I am. But the way that he's saying that he's justified doesn't actually work. And you're making the claim that this problem is universal. And a route that you should have taken, I think, is to say, all right, well, how do you get out of this problem? If the pragmatist is saying that it's universal, and this is the reason why the pragmatist is saying it's universal, how are you getting out of that problem? Mm-hmm. And he kept going to this idea of using a transcendental argument, which, when it comes right down to it, is still presupposing the existence of logic, because it's a transcendental argument on the basis of logic. At least that's what I'm familiar with the tag. Like, that's what it does.
He doesn't use. If you're saying you're familiar with tag as in like Matt Slick's variant, his variant's actually different from Matt Slick. Him and Slick have disagreements.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. Well, either way, I don't know how he's getting out of the problem. Like, you'd have to ask him like how he's dealing with the issue of phenomena and noumena. That's like most of the conversation you guys were having, without saying the words, were about phenomena and noumena.
Well, did you see the earlier part of the conversation? Because we actually did get into phenomena and noumena.
Did you?
Yes.
You said the terms. Oh my goodness.
Yes, the terms were actually said because we were bringing up Kant.
I didn't see his opening statement.
But
I saw.
You can rewind. You can rewind to see it. But but phenomena and noumena were brought up because as a pragmatist, for me, I'm largely concerned with phenomena.
Right.
Noumena isn't terribly important to me because whether or not noumena is the case, I'll know how close we are to an approximation of noumena based on the fruits that are yielded from any particular efforts that are given. Again, I brought up the issue of like science and alchemy being the two things. Science obviously got us closer to noumena, as opposed to alchemy, which did not. Alchemy tried very hard and couldn't. But it was brought up as almost a footnote. Because Kant was brought up, because Kant argues a lot from pragmatism via phenomena and noumena in his works.
Yeah, and I think that this is a position where you and I agree very easily, and this is probably one of the reasons why we get along so fucking much, is that we both have a pragmatist approach of phenomena and noumena. But we also don't. Neither one of us claim make any sort of certainty or knowledge claim on deity or even reality.
And that's why. That's why when he says, "Well, you can't make knowledge claims," I'm just like, yeah, and you don't have to. I can make belief claims.
Right. You can make belief claims and just operate on beliefs, and I hold that position as well. So, we're just holding to slightly different beliefs, and we're pretty transparent about our methods of getting to them, and we have respect for each other's methods of getting to them. But what he's not showing. And the reason why we have those positions, I think that we agree on the issue of, well, there's this block there about making knowledge claims. That we can assume the laws of logic, but we don't necessarily need a justifier in the same way that he's putting forward. So why does he need that why is he, like, saying God exists doesn't account for the laws of logic? It doesn't actually do anything. It just claims that there's a justification, but I don't know what the relationship is. I don't know why you need it.
Mm-hmm.
And just because, just because you don't do that doesn't mean that his process works. So, going after why he thinks his process actually solves the problem that you have would have revealed a little bit more, I think.
Probably. I largely ended up defaulting on my position there a bit, just going, okay, yeah, you claim this thing's a problem with my position, but it's not a problem. Just as you would say, I should have actually argued, come to think of it, that just as you claim that this is a problem with my position because of the way your worldview functions, I'm going to make an equal claim that anytime I make a morality claim about your position, you're going to claim that no, that's actually not a problem because of how my worldview works. We can do this.
That's objectively true, sir.
The problem. I actually have my. If you want, actually, you know what? Instead of going through his opening statement, because that's 10 minutes long, I can send you my notes because I took notes on his whole opening statement.
I figured. Is that where did he mention noumena?
Noumena was in our cross-examination.
Okay. I didn't hear phenomena and noumena get mentioned, but I know that's what you guys were talking about a lot.
Yeah.
But he doesn't solve. Do you think that he presented any sort of case that actually solves the problem of that gap between noumena and phenomena?
No, because to me, presuppositionalism always seems to boil down to you're basically arguing that because I can assert X thing, I've solved the problem. But you've failed to demonstrate X thing, but then you've said that it's self-evident. But that's why I brought in, well, it's not self-evident if you require
That's
scripture.
What should have been chased down, because that's the key problem with presuppositionalism, is that right there. Like, just asserting it doesn't solve the issue. It's like, you're just saying you know things. All right, well, then explain to me how I can do that, because I don't know how to do that. We have this gap here. How are you crossing it? And if you're just asserting God, well, then I can assert a different God.
The only reason I
didn't
didn't want to assert a different God is because that's T-Jump's approach with asserting naturalistic pantheism as a placeholder for what the opponent has.
But it doesn't offer revelation. I could this is how I got Darth Dawkins to put me on his troll list, was when I said, well, Odin did this.
Mm-hmm.
And he got really mad at me because he couldn't just say that I'm not actually a polytheist, because I am a polytheist. There's like, other people have tried that approach with him, and what Christians usually do with that is like, well, you don't believe in Odin, so your whole fucking argument falls apart. And I'm just like, well, actually I do, so whatever.
Yeah, and
I don't believe that about it. Like I don't think that Odin gives revelation as to the reality of, like, that's stupid. But that's the function that Christians do, and I still think it's stupid.
This is the reason. The reason that I didn't pursue it in that way is because my criticism of T-Jump's position of naturalistic pantheism is that he doesn't hold to that, and yet he hides behind it in debate. And I know that this person has had dealings with T-Jump with that argument specifically. So I was like, well, I'm not going to go down that path. One, because I can't justify that position myself because my worldview doesn't have that. Two, even if I were to, he's had this song and dance once before.
Right. Did he do well against T-Jump? Because T-Jump's not hard.
So it's hard for me to say. When I'm dealing with any T-Jump debate, it's really hard for me to say if somebody's doing well or not against him, because T-Jump's a one-trick pony. He just does you haven't proven your position. Naturalistic pantheism is what I can appeal to, and then he just mirrors the opponent's position the entire time. Like he just mirrors his opponent's position,
which I think it works. That kind of argumentation works fairly well against somebody who's trying to assert knowledge, because he can just say, "Well, naturalistic pantheism is possible." That's all he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
But with me, I can just say, well, yeah, naturalistic pantheism is possible. I don't adhere to it because I don't agree with it.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I didn't want to follow through so hard with the moralistic arguments, because I know what would happen with that. Granted, I didn't have time to anyway.
How do you know that's true? How do you know it's true? How do you know it's true?
And actually, no. Eventually, he would
say that it's objectively wrong that raping babies or whatever the fuck it is.
Yeah, you don't want to know the way I was formulating that in my head. It would have created a problem with my video. Though, ask Raz at some point, or when we're not live, I'll let you know the way I had formulated that question in my head. But it was not quite a reductio, but definitely fairly close to that, and it would have gotten a guttural reaction. But I didn't want that, because I saw that happen with Skylar, and I saw him run from Skylar.
Skylar goes moral monster nearly all the time. Speaking of one-trick ponies, he's good at it. He's really good at it, but that's his thing.
Yeah,
that's what he's best at, and it's what he just tends to just stick to doing. Which is, I mean, it's good. Like, he's got a series of videos in which he uses moral monster to just rip people apart. Whereas the thing that I think the difference between the one-trick poniness of Skylar and the one-trick poniness of T-Jump is
Skylar's entertaining.
Skylar's entertaining and effective. T-Jump is neither. But whatever. Anyway, that's beside the point. Fuck. I don't know. Where am I going? I'm just gonna just walk over here now. So you didn't go chase him down on morality. You could have definitely done that with him and gotten moral monster on him, but you chose to go down the whole ontology route.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part. Meh.
Yeah. I don't know. It basically boiled down to, I've seen what happens in the mirror scenario, because that's all T-Jump can do. And I've seen what happens in the moral monster scenario, which is why I waited until practically the end of the debate to start getting into the moral issue, so I could just go, okay, let me go
asking about hell being just.
Let me go ahead and shoehorn these moral issues in real quick, so that I can say that I've done it, and I can point out that this is an issue I have with this individual's positions going forward if I need to.
Right. But I do think that the right thing to chase down is the foundational approach, because I think that first that's a huge difference between you and other atheists or philosophical agnostics. But I think that there's a couple of other like final nails in the coffin that I think you could have done that you didn't do.
Okay.
Unfortunately, which I detailed earlier about the foundation of like just because you don't have a justification for having absolute knowledge doesn't mean that he does. Same with justification for laws of logic. Just because you don't have it doesn't mean that he does.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of people will admit that like, hey, we hold these axiomatically and that's fine. We make base assumptions so that, and
But see, he doesn't hold to those axiomat. He thinks that a presupposition is different from an axiom.
Yeah. I don't understand that part. I thought that your illustration of the argument from the ass was perfect to show that this is like, yeah, we may not be able to know, but we still make a decision, and so that we can operate through life, so that we don't starve to death like the ass. But that point seemed lost on him.
Because he dialed back to, well, you can't do anything under skepticism. Like, that's wonderful, because skepticism is one piece of a pragmatic philosophy, and it's a piece you could operate with or discard, depending on your goals. For like, pragmatism is based entirely on its end goal. My end goal, when it comes to things like debate and stuff, is to accept other attempts at solving things and adapt them into my own epistemology, because they all have varying levels of utility for me. So, yeah, I'll adapt skepticism in order to give me the initial, I don't have an answer to this, hold on, and then start moving into, well, which one of these is most approximate to what we would expect in noumena. And that's something that skepticism on its own can't handle.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But I don't know. I think he clued in, because the first thing he said when we did the first part of the cross-examination, the first thing he clued into was like, well, wait a minute, hold on. You're different from other atheists that I've debated against.
Yeah. I saw him have that.
They're just like that. Oh, wait, hold on a minute.
Right after your opening statement, he was like, "Oh shit, this is new."
What's funny though is I basically just reworded the video that I had done on the topic previously.
Yeah, I saw you doing that. I saw you make the inch analogy, all that shit. You sent me that video, and I was like, oh, okay. At first, I thought that you were talking about another element of it, but I was like, oh, okay, all right, never mind. You're just using this for your own study. Got it.
Yeah, it was basically me going, well, I know I have a positive position, because normally I don't like doing debates that have opening statements and stuff. I prefer having actual conversation, because I think that yields more fruit. But because instead of an actual conversation we had to do a debate, I was like, well, shit, I have to make an opening statement, and I've got to make it in 20 minutes. Well, as it turns out, I've got a 10-minute opening statement in video form that I can just copy down my verbiage for and adapt it to the conversation at hand, and use that.
It's the laziest approach to a debate opener I've ever fucking seen, Cyrus.
Did it work?
Yes.
And what am I mostly concerned with?
It's the approach of a fucking...
What else do you expect? The approach of the pragmatist is to not work twice.
That's beautiful. I love that. I'm crying.
You're just like, I want to criticize you for your laziness, but
I know, but it's like, did it work? Well, yeah. I mean, if it's stupid and it works, it ain't stupid. You know,
there we are. I'm wondering if any of the long-term watchers in my audience actually like clued into the fact that I was literally just taking the God is a contradiction video and rewording it. I know you caught on to it because I sent you the video right before.
Well, yeah, you told me what you were doing, so I had the cheat sheet open. So I was like verbally calling you out on it when I saw that, but I didn't.
Were you actually upset at that?
No, I wasn't mad. I was just, I was a little upset, I guess. I was like, I thought it was. When did you find out about this debate? You didn't have long to prepare at all.
Oh, no. So here's the thing. I had about a month to prepare.
Oh, never mind.
But remember also that I've had hell in a handbasket to deal with in between now and then.
Yeah. Both of us have had meteors just hitting our lives really hard lately. It's just been insane.
So so Edsgy Mo says someone link the OG video. Fine, hold on. I got you real quick. Also, if you guys are wondering why the debate was on my channel as well, and I'm doing this post-debate talk.
Hey,
Hold
God.
on. Oh, God, this is back when me and Godless Iowan were friends.
That's what I thought you were referencing. I was like, we can remake it.
Well, I think I just did. I'll just clip that 10-minute opening from the video and just be like, yeah, this is the new video.
I'm happy to be the voice of God for you whenever you want, sir.
God damn it. So with that with the debate,
Speaking of being the voice of God, Prophet of Zod reached out to me for a collab in which I will be voicing Jordan Peterson.
Oh, excellent. He's also got another thing that he's been working on called Enter the Zodverse that he has not finished yet, but I can't wait till it comes out because I'm playing you saw Enter the Spider-Verse, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I haven't. Actually, no, I just lied to you. No, I haven't seen that.
Okay.
The reason why I say yes is because I've had so many fucking conversations and meetings around the animation style in that film, but I haven't actually seen the goddamn thing. So I've seen clips of it because it was relevant to some of the meetings that I've been having, but it wasn't. I haven't actually seen the film. I need to though, because then I'll be more informed in the meetings that I've been in.
It's on Netflix and it's good, and you should definitely.
It's on Netflix. Oh,
yes.
Sure.
You should
just watch it.
You should definitely go fucking watch it. It's a good movie. Anywho, so
thank you, sir.
The movie itself features a character called Spider-Ham, who is a
Spider-Ham.
Yes, he's a play on the whole Spider Pig thing from The Simpsons. But in this, he's a canonical character that thinks, speaks, and operates with autonomy, for better or worse. But his voice is very distinct. It's a very cartoon voice. Welcome to the God damn it, what is it called? Welcome to the Circus of Values.
I'm just gonna have to step back. All right. So anyway, how does this have to do with it?
So that is the character that I'm playing in his Enter the Zodverse video. I am playing Prophet of Zod, if he were a cartoon pig.
Well, fuck yeah.
Which is because Zod messaged me and he's like, "Well, hold on, Chris, you're really good at doing voices that don't seem like they're within your range. Hold on, could you do the Spider Pig voice from Spider-Verse?" And just hold up a second. Give me a moment. Oh, that reminds me. I've also got another voice I got to do for him. Fuck. I have to do Lee Strobel.
The fuck?
I'm voicing over a cartoon Lee Strobel. I think it's in the same video. I think.
Are we doing the same thing?
I think we're doing the same thing.
Yeah,
You're Jordan Peterson and I'm Lee Strobel.
I'm Jordan Peterson. Yeah. Yeah. So, we're gonna have a good time. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be fantastic.
So here's the thing.
Lobsters will be taking over the entire Jeopardy screen.
I have not actually practiced my Lee Strobel, so I can't do this live.
I need to do more Jordan Peterson before I actually record that because that imitation was shit. Don't worry, guys. I'm aware, but
you need to say I like beer a couple times, and you'll be good.
Oh yeah, if I like beer, and then I go into Jordan Peterson, it gets a little bit better. But I need to listen to some interviews with him or something like that, and then because I think I've explained this before that Jordan Peterson, Brett Kavanaugh, and Kermit the Frog all require the same kind of throat contortions in order to make imitations of them.
Yep, it's just Brett has a higher pitch, Jordan has a lower pitch, and
yeah. Jordan Peterson, you basically fry Kermit the Frog.
Josiah Hansen for $5 says, "I'd like to do a Pheasant Sirs fan art, but I couldn't draw it to save my life, so instead have a little bit of money." Okay. Well, thank you very much for the $5. I'm actually glad that Super Chats didn't come in during the course of the debate because I would have felt compelled to answer. And it would have been like, no, it's not my stream. I can't do that.
Yeah.
It's mine now, though. Ha!
Ha! Bitches. We've taken over.
Also, can I just say that leveling up as a Fury Warrior without the Bloodthirst ability is a pain in the ass? I'm getting real upset not having bloodthirst.
Your face is a pain in the ass.
Also, if anybody
Alright.
in the chat's wondering why I'm using daggers on a Fury Warrior, it's my warrior. I play it how I fucking want.
So, getting back to a discussion of the debate, because we're not talking about the debate anymore. We should end this fucker. What is? Do you agree with? I guess you agree with my assessment. I think you did well, though. I will say
I felt
he seemed really pleasantly surprised that he was dealing with an atheist that was willing to make claims.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of Christians aren't useful. They're used to just the backpedally.
Like the ball. Crap.
I'm a lack of belief atheist type of deal.
Mhm. I'm not convinced. Yeah.
I mean, I did say I'm not convinced, but I also added qualifiers.
Right. I was looking like atheists like Matt Dillahunty and so on will take the I'm not convinced route.
Yeah. And I recognize why Matt does it. The reason why Matt does it, and I'm actually very much in agreement with the reason why he does it. His method is not to elevate debate for discourse's sake. His method is to make it to where the everyday atheist that is having to argue, like say with their parents or with their community about why their position is what it is to give them essentially an unassailable position so that they can. For lack of a better word, better protect themselves is probably the best way to word it.
Yeah, and it does that well. If you simply hold a look, I need to be convinced position, then
it works really well for that.
It specifically it works really well against somebody who's being aggressive with you.
Yes,
and coming after you.
And
which is what
as somebody who lives
with
in the
for
South.
the most part.
He's dealing with that. He's in Texas, so of course that's exactly what he's dealing with.
Of course, that's exactly what he's dealing with. And so if you have somebody who really wants to convert you, saying I'm not convinced, winds up with a situation in which they want to change your mind, and especially because they want to convert you and all that shit, and they want to be like, I'm right. And so they'll be aggressive. But if there's somebody like, say, a lot of polytheists who aren't evangelical, don't proselytize, it doesn't work as well necessarily, because it's like I'm not convinced, and we're like, okay, go be not convinced.
German visitor in the chat just asked, is this really vanilla? Why are you not having to bandage between every enemy? That's because the rule for leveling up on a Fury Warrior is be 5 levels above everything you fight, or your life is a living nightmare. That's the rule. If you want to die a lot, fight things at your level. If you want to survive leveling up as a Fury Warrior, bully enemies weaker than you.
So this is all footage that Cirrus is a bully.
Speaking of footage,
it is ontologically
Ocean,
the case.
I have a thing to show you.
Uh-oh.
You're gonna love this. Hold on.
No, I'm not.
Have you seen the anime for Castlevania yet?
What's Castlevania?
Oh my fucking god. Okay. So, here. This is
I'm half kidding with that. I'm familiar with what Castlevania is, kind of.
Here you go.
I have not seen an anime or anything like that.
This is how I feel.
I did see the clip that you posted on Twitter a while ago, though, where the person faints. No,
check this one out specifically. I just sent it to you on Discord.
This is what you posted on Twitter. Oh no! Oh no! I deal with that a lot.
It has nothing to do with any god or
nothing to do with God.
I love these clips. I was watching it, so I started clipping the shit out. I'm just like, these are wonderful for reactions.
It seems like you need to clip the shit out of this. Please send that. You did send that to me.
Yeah,
so I'm going to download this.
There's also this guy right here.
This is gonna make it into a video of mine.
Oh, I hope so. These are wonderful.
This is definitely gonna make it into a video of mine.
Also, this is from the conversation when I was doing my study on this guy. This one is from the conversation between him and TJ.
Yeah, I saw. This is the one that you posted on Twitter. Oh no!
No, this one. This is where I realized exactly how many bullets he would willingly bite.
Okay, I'm gonna watch this. It's 21
so
seconds.
Any involuntary imposition of will is an immoral action.
Okay, can you explain that in a little more simpler terms? So any what?
Forcing someone to do something they don't consent to is immoral.
Okay, and how do you know that that's immoral?
Moral intuition and moral progress.
Okay, whose moral intuition? I don't have a moral intuition that's true. So.
Sure. So any
Ooh.
involuntary.
Okay, so he doesn't have a moral intuition that it's.
Are you fucking kidding me?
He doesn't have a moral intuition that it is true that you should not force somebody to do something they don't consent to.
The fuck? Do you have to be a sociopath to be a Calvinist?
That's what it seems to be in this case.
Maybe Calvinism is a good solve for sociopathy. Except it makes things worse because then they think God is sociopathic. That was one of the things that I got confused about with Calvinism, is it seems like God is sociopathic.
It's also when he accidentally equivocated fair and just. It's just like, hold up. Hold up. I didn't say fair. I didn't say fair. No,
that's a catch. That's a catch I wouldn't have made, by the way, like in the moment. I think that was really good on you, because if I were in that situation, I would have let him equivocate and he would have gotten away with it.
If there's one thing I've gotten from conversations with like Nick Suter, it's that when you start delving into fallacies and you point them out as a job, and I do all my, and you've seen how I do my videos editing process. I do the entire thing live and then edit it down.
Yeah. Dude, guys, I just want to tell you, trying to do a fucking collab with this fucker. So the way that I make my videos and the way Cyrus makes his videos, if you see like how often, like Cyrus's way of making videos is so much fucking faster than what I do, that it hurts my brain, that I wind up losing my shit in his process, because I write a script out and I go find my sources and I get everything together and then I release a video. I find my sources if I need sources, but then I like go through and throw it out there. Cyrus, this fucker, will just go off the top of his fucking head at somebody, and he's good at it. Like, he just goes through all the things and so on. And I think that it winds up, there's pitfalls of it, and that some things kind of go unnoticed. But he's good at it. He winds up catching a lot of things right then and there on the spot that a lot of people won't. And it's, again, like, I guess I agree with you that if you're doing that consistently, then of course there's going to be you're gonna be catching things a lot quicker, especially if you're doing this every fucking day like you do.
Yeah, and I've actually, for people who are patrons of mine, I'm actually releasing videos faster than YouTube would believe, because as I'm creating them, I'm putting them on Patreon for early access now. For those who are,
I saw that.
Yeah,
I'm a patron of Cyrus. You should be a patron too.
I'm trying to get videos done quicker so that I can get them through YouTube's review process, because I got auto demonetized, and YouTube's I've been saying this in a lot of episodes now, but for brevity's sake, 2 months ago my revenue on YouTube was $1,600 a month, and I'm down to about $400. That's how much YouTube's cut into my funding. So as a result, I'm like, okay, obviously they're demonetizing all of my shit. I'm going to go ahead and get stuff done early, just so I could get it reviewed early and see.
Yeah, that's what some people have to do. And Mr. Atheist has to do that too.
Mr. Atheist does. Telltale does. I've made a point of mentioning it was in a group with Telltale. I said it's weird that I always end up taking about a year to listen to any advice that Telltale says, even though the advice is consistently good. Mm-hmm. Because it took me almost a year to actually get to the point where I was scheduling videos, and then it took me the second year to get to the point where I was making them early, so that they could be reviewed. And these are both bits of advice from Telltale to me.
Yeah,
but here we are.
I've been making them early, but also I don't have like a consistent release schedule. I just upload something and then I wait a day. So if you're a patron of mine, you get to see what I upload early. But I also upload so rarely. Like last one took me 3 weeks between video releases, but that's also just because my life has been a fuck. And now it's like, oh shit, it's been a week since the last time I released a video. I need to do something. And I'm sitting at, guess what I'm doing? My fucking YouTube channel is sitting at 2,999 subscribers, and it's been like that for a day. I'm losing my fucking mind. Someone subscribe to me, please. Like, so I can have 3K. That's where I'm at. Oh, somebody subscribed to me.
Ah, there you go. Your problem solved.
Yep, there it is.
The real purpose
There
of
it is.
ocean hopping on here was not to give me critique. Honestly, it was simply to steal a
It
subscriber.
was to get one subscriber.
One single
So, now
subscriber.
I have officially hit 3,000 subscribers, sirs.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad.
This is happening live.
I am. There we go. I almost died to this Kodo because this Kodo is one level above me. It is not a thing I can bully. That
Oh, you know
almost
who's in
ended
your
badly.
chat right now?
Matt Powell.
Yeah, fucking Cupcake showed up.
Yeah, I see. He's cute.
He's being adorable.
I feel like a dick. Okay, cool. He got it. He stole it from me. That's good. I would have been really upset that I had tagged this guy Satyr right as he shot him. That would have made me really sad.
And then we would cry. Everybody say hi to Cupcake in the chat. He deserves some attention.
Specifically that
He
way.
wants it really badly. Just say hi, Cupcake. Ask how Sprinkles is doing.
The only thing I'm upset about right now is that what I thought the format of the debate was going to be for a month was 10-minute openers and then like just one cross-examination where we'd get to like ask a question.
Yeah, like get
each.
to modern day debate style, like you guys would just talk to each other, right?
Yeah, but instead it was we're gonna have 10 minutes each of cross-examination. I'm like, I don't like formal debate. I don't. It doesn't get us anywhere. But sure, why not? We're here. We're having this
It winds
conversation.
up just being like formal debates wind up just being a presentation of ideas, which is fine. And then you score that presentation of ideas as far as who undermined the other person the best in their presentation of ideas. I don't like that so much as somebody who's done it a lot. I hate it. I think that because I did it in college for a lot, and the format always frustrated the shit out of me. I prefer conversations. I want to be able to have a little bit of back and forth, ask questions, put pressure on people, have people put pressure on me, and have like a little bit of a back and forth, and really suss things out. Because I think that's the only way you're able to suss things out is if you have that in the moment snap going back and forth, especially with people that are honest and willing to say, "Hey, I don't know the answer to that."
Yeah, the only problem is that when we're dealing
Yeah.
with like a Calvinist, they
don't do that.
They don't. They go, well, I don't. They don't say I don't know. They say, well, that's beyond my knowledge. That's God's knowledge.
Right.
Which, at that point, again, it doesn't sound much different to me than mein Führer says mein Aunt is Jewish. I don't see a difference between those two things. I don't.
Yeah, well, I mean, it means God's a psychopath or a sociopath, right? It's just he winds up. It's like this lack of emotional.
I would argue psychopath is more apt since psychopaths are born, and sociopaths are made. And if something made God into a sociopath,
is that it? Is that the difference?
Well, there's functionally no difference because neither are accepted in the DSM-5.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, the DSM-4 was the last time we got any writing that referred to those things as psychopath and sociopath. What we found is that there's such a marginal difference between the two. That you're familiar with argument of the heap. That trying to find a distinction between the two essentially boiled down to an argument from the heap. So what they did instead was classified sociopathy and psychopathy into a larger spectrum of antisocial personality disorders. So now we just label them all as ASPD in varying varieties, much like how autism...
So you have ASPT, two different extremities.
Yes, much like how autism is defined in a spectrum of different extremities as well.
Got it. That makes sense. I guess. I don't know. I feel like I would need to have Shannon Q on here to suss that out a little bit more.
That's fine.
But speaking of just community news, have you seen what the fuck is going on over there on that end of the internet?
On Shannon's channel?
Yeah, not like so Shannon, and I love her for this. has wound up deciding to fight the entire atheist community over whether or not religion is mental illness.
Yeah, you know what? And I'm perfectly fine joining her in that fight.
Oh yeah, no, same here, dude. And it's surreal, dude. The amount of people, like Atheist Husker, good our buddy, said like if you hold that position, unfollow me.
If you hold the position that it's a mental illness, unfollow me.
Yeah.
Well, Nathaniel is actually in the chat, I believe.
He's a fucking reasonable human.
This is,
or he retweeted it and said same. Like somebody else said that, and he retweeted it and said same.
This is one of the reasons that me and Nathaniel get along.
Yeah,
because he's a reasonable fucking human being.
Also, someone wants a link to my channel in the chat, so I'm gonna be that guy.
Yeah, do it. Plug yourself.
Yeah, I'm gonna be that guy, and plug myself. There you go. There you go. I have hit 3K. I'm really happy about that.
That's good.
It now doesn't say 2.9.
Yeah, because the freaking YouTube system now is just like 2,999. Don't you mean 2.99K?
Round up. Don't always round down, you shit.
Also, Aaliyah Kai just donated $10 for you because I can. Well, thank you very much for that. Also, good job LARPing Katarina there.
For those that want my link, it is now in the chat.
Oh my god. I feel like these scorpions are going to be really, really far and few and far between. Do I really want to actually grab that? I don't know if I really want to grab those scorpions. You know what? Screw this quest. Screw scorpions. I don't want to get them. Sub-Zero's better.
Don't screw scorpions. That seems really dangerous.
Yeah, Sub-Zero's better.
Should I play WoW Classic?
Do you like having fun?
No.
Okay, well then I guess you don't want to play WoW Classic.
Thanks.
And me and Raz and Aaron and Aaliyah Kai and Pig Puncher, and granted Pig's on a different server than I am, but all of us are playing. So like, if you want to have an argumentum ad populum for yourself, then there's that.
There you go. Get that ad populum going.
It's also, funnily enough, it also topped charts on Twitch. It beat out Fortnite. It beat out League of Legends. It beat out like everything. Classic WoW beat out everything when it released.
I've been playing the new hit game Spyro the Dragon on Twitch, though.
The remake?
Yes. Yeah.
The remake. Pikachu, I did not see the shitstorm in the chat during the debate because I was so. Here's the thing: when I'm doing a debate, I don't pay attention to the chat because that diverts my attention, and I already have issues with my attention going multiple places. During the debate, I was taking notes, and I took. You can ask Ocean for verification. A lot of notes.
Yeah, he took a fuckload, exactly one fuckload.
I sent Ocean the notes so that he could look at the opening statement in notation form, which I don't think you've done yet, have you?
I did actually.
Okay, cool.
I scrolled through it a little bit. Non-Christian worldview systems are not defensible, sirs.
That's what's in there.
Yep, that's what he said. That's the thing that he said.
Woo.
Okay. Apparently, when I tried to post the link, it didn't work. So there we go again. Oh boy. All right. Well, bloody-do. I think I am going to head out, good sir.
Gonna do a head out.
I'm going to do a head out.
Okay.
It was enjoyable watching the debate, and I know that you are going to debate again today.
Yep, that's going to be with Aaliyah Kai and Cygart over on Modern Day Debates channel.
And there's also another guy, right? There's he's an Orthodox Jewish dude. John Grishal.
Yes, he was the one person that I did not recognize out of that.
Oh, I know things. If you want to,
John Gishala.
Yeah. He's been around the scene for a long time. He's like a hardcore Zionist.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about that.
I'll tell you more later.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. In fact, there's things you should know.
Okay, then hold on. This person is trying to run away from. You're level 32. It's just a scorpion. Just kill it. Holy shit. It's not hard. Freaking priest running away from a scorpion is just like, dude, it's your level. Just kill it. You need the it's WoW Classic. Kill everything you see. You need the experience. It's not you can't just run through and not kill the things.
So, anywho, I'm going to take off. It was good hanging out with you. I think you did well in this debate. I wish you luck on the next one. You should do well. So,
hopefully.
Yeah.
That said, I'm probably going to close out this stream and recoup so that my voice is not like a fuck
completely
nugget.
Fucked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I will.
It's a 4-way debate, so you wind up being able to just like
take a breather.
Relax. Yeah. As everybody starts in fucking fights with each other. Although you're going to be the atheist, so.
I mean, so I'm okay being the atheist in a group of people because my position doesn't really put me as the atheist 99% of the time.
Yeah, because are you philosophically an atheist or an agnostic?
Philosophically an agnostic.
Okay.
I end up being the atheist as far as common parlance is concerned, but as far as philosophical positions go, my position is one of suspended belief.
Right. Which puts you in the situation as the ass.
Yep. Which is why I only take a position when common parlance requires I do so. But as far as being forced...
Which is when, like, that's part of the ass actually is where I wind up making a decision on polytheism.
Mm-hmm.
Is because I think that atheism and polytheism are both have like similar levels of justification. But I wind up going with one of them.
You just swing the other way.
Yeah, I just wind up swinging the opposite way than pretty much anybody else.
Probably why we end up... I think the methods that we use to get to our conclusions are like...
super similar.
Are 99% similar. It's probably one of the reasons we get along.
Right. I think that's true. And I didn't... And, like, it's interesting... It's... Yeah. Because we do use extremely similar methods. One of the reasons why I promote Frith and Grith as much as I can on my channel has to do with the utility of it, and it's pragmatic for the atheist community to listen to that idea. And that I think that right now, honestly, in the atheist community, with all the fucking earthquakes that are going on, the concept of Frith and Grith is actually fucking needed.
Well, yeah, because people can actually go, hey, hold on, what are our end goals? What are we trying to do? Are we working towards the same goal? And if we are we just taking different approaches, but they're both towards the same goal? And if that's the case, then is there not
can you imagine how like progress that could be made if like all the people that are like if you get some of the major players, especially EOT and rationality rules, into a situation in which, all right, Grith is declared. Everybody that is communicating in this space has to communicate in a respectful way. Let's figure out solutions and figure out, and the truce ends once everybody leaves. Yeah. But while we're having this conversation, the truce is on.
As opposed
see
to
if we can figure out any progress.
As opposed to the current method where it seems that everybody has a trebuchet aimed at the other side, and they're firing arrows of varying sizes with varying degrees of success on where those arrows land.
That would be a ballista, by the way.
Correct.
But
I'm wrong.
Yeah. I will correct you on your medieval weaponry.
That's okay. Then fine, it's throwing rocks better.
So a friend of mine, I think, Callan was pointing out to me that this is a very large... this is basically Njal Saga. Njal Saga is basically a story of like escalating tensions between blood feuds, where it just gets more and more ridiculous. And I think that also applies to this situation too. Where it's just like, Jesus, guys.
That's basically what's happened, especially since I'm not going to get into the details of the situation. I've made my I've made my videos and my perception of the situation, how I feel that things have gone. So I'm not going to go any further than that because I don't think that actually helps. I think that the idea...
I don't either.
I think that the idea that everybody should figure out what their end goals are, and if we have the same goals, we need to figure out how we best work towards them, as opposed to firing fucking ballistas or trebuchet, either way. Whichever method you have to impale and or crush your opponent, take your pick.
Correct.
I would much rather people figure out how we actually go about dealing with this, because you know what? This is like freaking Vosh made this point on like leftist infighting. When he was pointing out, it's really weird that a group of people that all hate capitalism and find there to be a lot of like
work together.
Yeah, that can't work together just on the idea that by working
here's the worst
together,
part about it is that a lot of them believe in seizing the means of production and having society work together for the betterment of mankind.
It's just that
they can't work together.
No, like one of the did I just get shocked by that thing? Okay, I did. It's like one of the feuds right now seems to be, again, this is an issue of method. Like Vosh's method is very ham-fisted, smash the opponent down. I'm going to rhetorically beat the ever-loving fuck crap out of you. Like that's what he does. It's what Vosh is good at. But then you've got Thought Slime, if you're familiar with Thought Slime, and he has an approach that is much more similar to, hey, if one of the axioms of the left is supposed to be compassion, why do we think that the means of production shouldn't be owned by a capitalist? Well, that's because they exploit the workers, so it's an exercise of compassion to relieve the means of production from capitalists. Okay, so why is it mostly a left-wing talking point that we should have like curtails on speech, for instance, not like strictly hate speech laws? A lot of those end up coming into like really absurd areas, but like there are some people that will argue that even calls for violence should be necessarily allowed. And a lot of people on the left will say, well, no, we don't think that's the case. Well, why? Well, it's, again, rooted in compassion. So his position seems to largely be that when you take the ham-fisted smack them down rhetoric, you end up losing that compassionate side that should be like the ethos of leftist argumentation, because it seems to be that the right wing largely isn't much too fussed about compassion. That's not a thing that they really argue about, unless it's semi-aborted fetuses. In that case, yeah, they'll argue for that. That's like the one thing they'll use compassion for. And I find myself kind of stuck between the two of those, because I'm like, yeah, there are some people who are swayed by compassion, but there are some people who fall into a lot of like alt-righty politics just because the ham-fisted burn all the torches approach, sometimes literally with tiki torches. It appeals to them. They're not there for the ideas, they're there for the approach. So why not give them that approach with ideas that are actually good ideas?
Then you get the dirtbag left.
And that's basically how you get the dirtbag leftists. And I think I'm not sure if you're familiar with Peter Coffin.
No.
I guess I'm
so like here's the thing, like
I'm probably more familiar with LeftTube than you are.
Yeah, I'm not. Like because one and here's where I'm gonna piss off everybody. I think that the Republic is the best form of government.
Okay.
And I'm also more of like a regulated capitalist type than I am any sort of like socialist or anything. Where I do get into agreeing with socialist policies are on things like healthcare and military management and stuff, where our country is already on uses socialist approaches for managing military, but we don't do it for managing healthcare. I think that it would be much more useful for managing healthcare, because like on a basic needs approach like that, it winds up completely fucking everybody over. And from there you can start to make with the arguments that you use for healthcare, you can start to have discussions about what kind of entitlement programs and such need to be had, and so on. But that puts me as more of a moderate than a leftist. So
I think that's where you end up being like very socially left, as we would consider, but like not quite so economically.
Right. And yeah, because like when we get into social issues, like damn it, I'm like I'm very left. But then you get into sort of economic policy, and it comes off as me being, well, I lean left, but I'm not like in a communist or socialist or especially not anarcho-communist position.
Yeah, whereas I end up being a lot more like a democratic socialist, or even just a so political.
I wind up being kind of a social democrat, but not a democratic socialist. Democratic socialism is too far from me.
Yeah, for me, I don't like. I'm not going to say I don't like social democrats. That's not the way to put it. I like democratic socialism as a method, because at that point you still have some of the necessary hierarchy for corporations to function. It's just that hierarchy is tethered under democratic voting, which I find to be much more useful than the rule by fiat that comes with being the capitalist who built it, because that doesn't necessarily mean that you are the best person for the job. And much like with what happened with the I'm not sure if you saw the debate between Friended Forever and Vosh.
I didn't.
Adam Friended makes the argument that, well, what about certain owners who do innovate, like Elon Musk? And Vosh is just like, yeah, when he does that, he's working. He's a worker in that capacity. Does he need the ownership as well as being the worker? I would argue that he does not need sole ownership as well as being the worker in that instance. So no, I prefer the idea of the ability to democratically elect within a corporation, because that can prevent a lot of corruption in corporations.
But that tends to be so a lot of ways that people handle democratic election in corporations has to do with share ownership. So,
yeah, and I don't like that.
But you
method.
buy your votes at that point. You buy how many votes you have. But then again, when you have this, gets into a question of democratic values versus property rights. If what's the point of making an investment if you don't see any bearings or have any control over your investment? So that's this is like, who should be making decisions then? Should it be the people that own part of that have the most to lose? Should their votes count more? And then you get into, well, who has the most to lose? Is it the person who's going to lose their job, or is it the person who invested thousands of dollars? And the person who invested thousands of dollars, if they lose all their investment, they may still be fine. Whereas the person who is working for the company may lose everything.
Yeah, and that's why you.
So then you get into that.
That's why you just give them all equal votes, because there's no metric to determine who loses more because of the amount of nuance required. So you simply give equal votes there, because at that point, the value of their votes falls on their value as a person, not how much they have to lose. And the value of their person within the company should be equal. Then you get into
a question. I have 43% share in the company, and another person has 2% share in the company. Should those two votes count the same?
I would argue that yes, because the leadership of the company should not be dictated by ownership, because in a democratic social system, share ownership, from what I understand, isn't a concept.
Okay. So you just basically drove a monster truck over property rights. And that's going to be where our big disagreement is going to be, is because property rights wind up being just like tossed under the bus.
Property rights? Are you okay? So are you making a distinction between personal and private?
I'm not sure what that distinction would be. I'm just saying that, like, if you're voting in in the company and you're not making a distinguishing. Oh, okay. You're talking about like whether or not somebody who contributes more to a government. I don't know actually how you would draw that comparison between, like, say, how a republic functions and how a corporation functions when it comes to investment and ownership. Nobody, like, people generally don't invest in the government.
Yes, and we still end up having to
So-
democratically elect. You would basically be running your corporations no different than the government does.
Like
just
a
with-
republic.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's essentially how you would be running them, so that if you have, for instance, an abusive boss, you as a worker have the power to vote
Have
that
the power
abusive
to
boss.
overthrow him and elect somebody else.
Yes.
And that makes some sense. I see how that could be. That could definitely fix some problems. But then it gets into question of share ownership and property rights and so on still.
You have to
Because
make the
there's
distinction.
There's a difference in, like, who's owning part of the company. Because then you're going to have to, in order for that to work, for a republic to work, you would have to have something collectively owned.
it collective ownership of the means of production is literally the ethos of leftist
Yeah, exactly.
politics.
Exactly.
So the thing that actually gets abolished,
but that runs over property rights when it comes to investment.
it runs over private property rights, but not personal property rights. There's a distinction made.
Okay, we'll have to get more into that later. I don't want to.
That's a rabbit hole of a second debate.
Yeah. That's a whole nother thing. I think I kind of see where you're going with that. Can a house be personal property? I guess that's the question.
Can a house that you reside in be personal property? Yes. Can a house that you are holding in a landlord capacity be personal property? No, that is private property at that point.
Okay, that's a good clarification. Thank you. I guess when it has to do with, like, utility to the individual.
Yeah, so, like, for instance, I would own everything in my house.
I didn't mean to get into this. Fuck, I asked questions.
You did. Now we're here.
Damn it.
You asked the lefty YouTuber lefty questions.
Yeah, time to go, and then I asked.
Here we are.
Fucking do that.
This is that side of YouTube that when, like, somebody like Christiosity says, "Yeah, Cyrus isn't left," and I'm just like, what? It's like, obviously you don't actually.
You're actually pretty collectivist. That makes a lot of sense.
It's like, you actually aren't watching my content, are you? Okay.
No, dude, we should totally, like, we should just have a conversation, like, about all this stuff where it's like, Cyrus and Ocean discussed a thing where it's like, I walk in and I'm like, hey, I'm like a political newbie, but here's some, like, fucking positions that I hold and some of the reasons why when it comes to shit like property rights.
Yeah, because when you said property rights, but you didn't make a distinction, I'm like, okay, I see the issue here because I
think property rights extends to landlord capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you get into questions of stuff like renting a room, right? So, like, that's the house that I live in. However, I'm also renting the room out.
Yeah, see,
so is the room now the personal property of the person that is renting the room? Is it no longer my personal property? Is it no longer? Do I not have property rights over who lives in the house that I?
Fun fact. Are you?
Why did I ask questions?
Are you a fan of Dragon Ball in any capacity?
You understand that I don't watch any media ever, Cyrus.
I recognize that as a producer of media, you don't consume media, and it's really strange.
What's Dragon Ball?
All right,
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm so kidding.
Okay,
I've read the first, like, 2 mangas of Dragon Ball.
Okay, so at some point, you and I are gonna have to sit down and actually go through that fucking show. God damn it.
We're gonna have to, like, yeah. I know who Goku is.
Okay, so do you know who Frieza is?
He's the one that had, like, the 17 episode battle with Goku, right?
Yes, his battle with his quintessential battle is the third season. Yeah, here we are. But
talking about Frieza.
His character, when Akira Toriyama wrote his character, he actually wrote his character as a land shark because he fucking hated the real estate market that much that he made him the quintessential villain of Dragon Ball. The real estate market is the canonical villain of Dragon Ball Z.
So Frieza's a landlord?
Yes, Frieza's a landlord.
Oh, I didn't
Frieza's story is that he's an emperor who uses the Saiyan race to take over planets so that he can sell the planets as real estate to other races who, like, for instance, if the human race were to almost destroy their planet.
He's not a landlord then, he's a developer.
Well, he is a developer. He's literally seizing other pieces for real estate and then selling them to other people. That's development.
Yeah, that's real estate development. Flipping. So he's basically a planet flipper.
He just literally called him a land
landlord.
shark. Like his
land shark. I guess a flipper would be a land shark.
So when he his whole thing is that, say we were to fuck over the Earth, we would then be in the business of potentially trying to buy a planet from Frieza, which does a couple things. One, you buy the planet and your race now owns the planet, but you also are now considered under. Yeah, and now you're here. Doesn't that suck? But once you do that, you actually end up under the servitude of Frieza as well. Anybody who is under Frieza as a individual, as a race, your race is also considered in service now to the Frieza Force. So he also becomes a landlord in that way because he is now your landlord.
That does make sense. All right. Yeah, that would be.
The whole story of Frieza is literally just like Frieza's a hyper-capitalist. and Akira Toriyama really didn't fucking like that. It really upset him.
That's not too bad. I get it now. I see why that would be objectionable. Is that he's basically... This is one of the things that comes with like hard capitalism, right? When you're just like, capitalism is the best, is that you wind up with these like Gilded Age problems.
Yep, and the end result of that, by the time we get to Dragon Ball Super, which is, of course, like 600 episodes into Dragon Ball's run, something like that, by the time we get to Super, the gods of that universe, because there's multiple universes in Dragon Ball, the gods of the universe in which Frieza resides in are asked a question. How many habitable planets are there in your universe? And I think the answer came up to like 17. And it's a direct result of like the god of destruction of that universe not intervening with Frieza, not just going, okay, fuck Frieza, fuck his imperialism. It's not doing too well, because like that's the job of the god of destruction, is to see when something like that's happening and just destroy it. It's gone, and then the god of creation to make something better in its place. That's their shtick in Dragon Ball. The god of destruction was literally too lazy to do anything about Frieza. And as a result, they only had so many habitable planets left.
When Dragon Ball gets into like how things work, it becomes very Hitchhiker's Guide.
Yeah,
like that's one of the things that surprised. Like when like Dragon Ball, I thought was like this super serious thing, and then I watched like elements of it as an adult, and then I watched like how they think how the afterlife works, and I was like, this is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, except as an anime.
Yeah, no, Dragon Ball. The things that are stereotypical about Dragon Ball are like the super serious, big bulky person fights. But then when you get to the actual lore, it's both beautiful and ridiculously silly.
It gets into absurdism, yeah.
Yeah, and
anyway,
it's great for that.
I am going to go this time.
Okay.
I am. And I'm not going to ask questions before I do. But anywho.
Do you have any final statements?
No, because if I make one, it's going to be
the rabbit hole begins.
There's a landmine. I'm just going to stomp on it like fucking A. But anywho, thank you guys for subscribing a little bit to my channel. I'm officially at 3K, which is awesome. You guys are great, and preach y'all. I'm gonna head out. And Cirrus, good luck on your upcoming debate tonight. You've got 2 going on today. I hope your brain doesn't completely get fried.
It's going to get fried.
Yeah. So good luck.
Okay. See you, man.
But yeah. All right. See ya.
And with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion, the debate and the discussion. And I'm going to continue doing my Scarlet Monastery quest.